I'd like to welcome the following officials to the meeting to discuss the National Broadband Plan. Mr Ciarán O'Hoban, Assistant Secretary from the Department of Communications, Climate Action and Environment. Mr Fergal Mulligan, Programme Director of the National Broadband Plan. Mr Patrick Neary, Chief Technical Officer. Ms Ciara Kennedy, Assistant Principal from the National Broadband Plan Division. And Mr Tom McCormack from the National Broadband Plan Division. I just want to read out a formal notice before we commence. I want to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if you are directed by the Chairman to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise or make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. I also wish to advise you that any submission or opening statements that you have made to the committee will be published on the committee website after this meeting. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official, either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So I'll just remind witnesses and our members to turn off your mobile phones because they interfere with the sound system. I will now invite Mr O'Hoban to make your opening statement. We
welcome the opportunity to attend today's meeting of the Joint Committee on Communications, Climate Action and Environment in relation to the National Broadband Plan. The Minister attended a meeting of the Joint Committee last week to discuss the National Broadband Plan and provided extensive detail to the Committee and answered questions. Accordingly, I don't propose to cover the detail addressed by the Minister, but will focus on the three themes identified in the correspondence from the Committee as being of particular interest, these being the rollout time, value for money including the cost-benefit analysis, and ownership. These themes were also addressed in some detail by the Secretary-General of the Department in his letter of 24 April last, which has been published on the Department's website. In the first year, turning to rollout, in the first year of rollout, National Broadband Ireland will deploy approximately 300 broadband connection points across all counties. It is anticipated that between 7 and 23 broadband connection points will be deployed in each county. And these BCPs will provide a community-based high-speed broadband service, enhancing online participation and allowing for the establishment of digital work hubs in these locations. A deployment plan will be made available by NBI once a contract is signed. NBI is aiming to pass 133,000 premises by the end of the second year of deployment, with 70 to 100,000 premises passed each year thereafter until rollout is completed. This means that by the end of year 3 of the rollout, almost 40% of the premises in the intervention area will have been passed. The timeline for deployment is informed in particular from the deployment of the AIRS Rural Fibre Network and learning from that project. And post-contract award, the Department will continue to work with National Broadband Ireland and with AIR to identify means of potentially reducing the overall rollout time. Turning to value for money, there has been, and rightly so, this has been a very key consideration in preparation of the National Broadband Plan contract over the past 3 years, and the contract contains strong provisions in this regard. These contractual controls will play a key role in ensuring that the costs are minimised and that the deliverables are met. Just to touch on some of the controls, they're very extensive, the controls in the contract, but I'd highlight a number. Subsidy is only released once proof that a relevant deliverable has been achieved, and then this has to be established by an independent certification process. Oversight of the purchase of materials and subcontractor contracts year on year forms part of the controls. There's also substantial oversight arrangements to monitor progress, costs and take-up. There's significant checkpoints at various stages in the project in addition to the ongoing monitoring. There's substantial clawback provisions on cost savings achieved or a share in future excess profits. There's key performance indicators to ensure that the service is maintained appropriately, significant penalties to address underperformance should it occur, and from a governance perspective then there's a standalone board responsible for the ring-fenced operations and day-to-day management of National Broadband Ireland, with a requirement to report to the Minister monthly, quarterly and annually. In addition, the Minister has an appointee to the board and there will be independent audit of accounts. As noted in the KPMG report published on the Department's website, value for money for the National Broadband Plan can only be measured during the deployment and operation of the contract, and it will be very much dependent on the state putting in place a fit-for-purpose oversight and governance regime. A strong governance team will be established within the Department initially to oversee the contract. In line with the Public Spending Code, a cost-benefit analysis was commissioned by the Department, and that cost-benefit analysis has been updated throughout the procurement process. This has been an iterative process involving extensive engagement by our own department with the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. The most recent version of the quantifiable CBA, the final version, demonstrates a positive benefit to cost ratio of 1.15 to 1 in a pessimistic scenario, but it's estimated to be as high as 2.14 to 1 in an optimistic scenario. I'm sure we'll return to the CBA in questions, but I think it's just a point for, at this stage is to note the CBA was based on a conservative estimate of the benefits, and it did not include unquantifiable benefits such as those associated with areas as e-health, e-education, social inclusion, rural development, tourism and climate. Finally, turning to ownership, the Minister addressed the question of ownership when attending the committee last week in some detail, so I don't propose to go into extensive detail on the ownership point right now, but happy to answer questions. But I would emphasise 3 points. The reusing existing infrastructure minimises costs and impacts on the environment and is in line with the relevant state aid guidelines. In looking at the ownership model, it's important to look at what is being owned versus what is rented. And finally, the ownership decision that was taken in July 2016, and it would not be possible to change the ownership model without a new procurement process. So I'll conclude at that, Cathaoirleach. We're quite happy to respond as detailed as we can here today, and if there's issues that are raised by members of the committee which require a more detailed or technical response, we're also happy to revert to the committee post today's hearing.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming before us this afternoon. I just have 3, I suppose, very quick questions for you, and that would have been raised by maybe members of the public as well, and you've probably answered some of them there in your own response back. But just the maximum capped cost to the state is €3 billion, and if you could illustrate how that could be reduced and what measures you have in place to reduce that amount. Also, are there examples from other countries regarding how the use of clawbacks have been successful? If you can give us examples of that from others, if any of the members want to come back on that. And also, just in relation to the use of the ESB, can ESB infrastructure be used instead of air infrastructure? And what engagement have you had with has there been with the ESB? Just those 3 questions before I move to my colleagues.
Okay, I'm going to ask Fergal Mulligan, Programme Director, to take the first 2 in a moment, and Patrick Neary, the CTO, to deal with the third technical point. I think what you will see, though, you will see coming through in dealing with cost in the context of any questions is that, and it's been very clear in terms of the Minister's presentation to the committee and in the Dáil, is that the cost that you're seeing is the maximum cost that this could be envisaged. It's a capped cost, and you have to work back from that to what the actual cost could be and is likely to be, and we have very clear views in relation to that. So I'll ask Fergal to pick up on the first 2 points.
Okay, thank you, Carlock. Deputies, I'll go through the subsidy because I suppose, like everything else in this project, the subsidy and even the makeup of a simple number is quite complicated. So it's 2.9 billion is the overall capped subsidy, which includes the VAT of 355 million. So we would look at this project as in net terms 2.6, in the order of 2.6 is the maximum net cost that could go out to third-party operators and the bidder. The 355 million wouldn't leave the department; it goes straight to the Revenue Commissioner. So, in terms of the amount of subsidy that's paid outside the department, it's around up to 2.6 billion. And within that 2.6 billion, there's 480 million that's set aside for eventualities that, at the moment, are unforeseen and potentially unavoidable, and which will be proven on a case-by-case basis by the bidder as being incurred. We will be working with the bidder over the next 10 years in terms of passing and connecting homes, because the 7-year deployment plan after that includes connecting homes, which runs for years and years. So that 480 million is not going outside the department until the actual cost incurred is verified as something that wasn't foreseen. It's for 14 discrete cost activities that we've identified with the bidder that they couldn't, with any reasonable degree of absolute certainty, put into their bid, because it's subject to future events in year 2, 3 and 4, which, were we not to agree a contingency fund with them, they probably would have brought it into their bid price anyway as a risk premium price. So we have it in a very controlled manner of 480 million. So that brings us back down to the overall gross, or the cost that's committed within the 25 years of 2.1 billion. And within that, 1.8 billion is committed up to year 10, and the balance is thereafter. The balance of between 1.8 and 2.1 is with regard to the cost of connecting premises and for the rentals of infrastructure. So again, capital-related costs beyond year 10. Again, that is only paid once it's incurred. The actual question of where can we reduce costs and where do we plan to reduce costs, because again, these are numbers that are in a spreadsheet at the moment. We hope will, when we come back here in 5 or 10 years' time, be a lot less than that. And that's the expectation. It won't be more, it can't be more, but we absolutely hope and expect it will be a lot less. And why do I think that? I'm going to break down the actual cost of this project into 3 things in terms of the capital cost of this project. And there are 3 categories. One is to actually pass premises, so 540,000 premises to pass. The second cost is to connect. And I suppose the third cost that is included in both of those is the cost of renting infrastructure. Okay? So we have a very, very good handle on the cost of passing, as did all bidders. It's in around, give or take, €1 billion to actually physically pass all premises in the state over the next 7 or 8 years. And that's BCPs, and it's the cost of, as I said, not renting the infrastructure. It's what that billion includes is all the material you have to buy, be it brackets on poles, be it new poles, because there is some new poles, be it fibre cable, 144,000 kilometres of cable, which I'll come to in a minute as well. It may not be 144,000 kilometres of cable, because that's based on bringing fibre to every single home, which we know is not likely to be the case. But we factor that into the cost of fibre cable. So that's, for example, an area where we don't expect to spend as much money on fibre cable, because we won't be bringing fibre cable to every single home. But we factor that into the bid as a worst case scenario. That's for example. The other big costs in the cost of passing are the sort of optical line equipment you would have back in the Eircom and ENET exchanges. So you have to buy lots of equipment. The bidder has publicly gone and said its preferred partner is Nokia. If it's Nokia or if it's somebody else, you have to pay for the equipment. And we've estimated all those costs in our own internal models and in the models of the bidder and the other bidders. And our own internal model in terms of cost of connecting or cost of passing, we were in around 5% different in the model that we had up to the final tender stage, because it's the most clear path, I suppose, of cost. How much does it cost to upgrade the actual the demands for the equipment, the Eircom exchanges, and bring fibre cable out the poles? The cost of upgrading the poles and the cost of remediating the poles and remediating the ducts, that sits with Open Air, and that's within the rental agreement with Open Air. So if we pay €20 a pole, the cost of replacing that pole, keeping that pole going for the next 35 years, that sits with Eircom, and that's the rental. And as we know, that rental is around €900 million over 25 years. How are we going to look at that rental of 900 million? Well, we don't. Comrig look at that. Comrig is fully 100% responsible for whether we pay 900 million, 800 million or slightly more. Now, if Comrig were to determine that pole price and duct price should be slightly more, we have factored that into our contingency of 480 million within one of those 14 buckets. But again, we've put aside a capped amount, and the bidder is on the hook for Comrig making a determination over the next 35 years that says the regulated price should be more than we currently see it today. That risk sits with the bidder, except for small amount of money that within the 480 we've set aside for the eventuality of Comrig raising the price. If Comrig reduce the price, we take back 100% of what was factored into the bid. We only pay what the actual regulated price is on the day, on the month, or on the given year. So again, we'd hope, obviously, but we've no ability to determine what that might be because it's an independent process run by Comreg, and they're, as we speak, going through a very detailed review of the pole and duct prices and other relevant prices to MBP and the market generally, and they will presumably publish documents in the coming 6 months around what the pole price should be for MBP and other areas of the country. And then the third area, which is the biggest unknown, is the cost of connecting. Okay, how much does it cost to get from the curtilage of every single road into every single premise and farm? Now, for all companies that were at the table for the last 3 years, that was the biggest debating point in every single dialogue and every modelling session with the technical guys and the engineers. And it is a very difficult area to go to in terms of estimating costs. So what we have done in the bid model and what we've accepted in the bid model is somewhere in the order of 400 to 700 million it will cost to connect homes. In terms of the 540,000, how many will get connected? You have to assume how many will get connected over the next 20 years. And that 400 or 700 million will only be paid based on the actual costs. So if it costs 300 million, we only pay 300 million. But up to a maximum of 700 or 680 million, I think it is, that's factored into cost to connect people. Obviously, again, we'll be working on every eventuality, be it technology choices or doing it in the most cost-effective way, depending on the premise and where it is. The demographics and geographics of where premises are off the curtilage of every road is unique to every single premise. Do you need to go underground? Do you need to go overground? Is there existing infrastructure there from Aircom or the ESB, or will we do a wireless solution? Those decisions will be made area by area, bit by bit, over the next 7 years, with our full oversight with the bidder, and the bidder has their full oversight month on month and quarter in terms of what they actually spend. So that's where we will be looking to month on quarter, reduce that maximum subsidy we called out to the least amount required. We said before in documents that we would, in a very optimistic scenario, potentially, but I think quite doable, you could see that subsidy coming down by up to €1 billion. If you get a cheaper past cost, but that's probably not likely to be the biggest saving you'll get. Potentially huge savings on the connection costs. Maybe Comreg will reduce prices, maybe they won't. And then lastly, will they need any of the 480 million that we've set aside for weather events, for inflation, for whatever might happen in year 2, 3, 4 and 5? If, again, in the best case scenario, none of those events happen and they're all avoided or avoidable, because we will look at other ways of mitigating having to dip into those buckets, well then you won't be touching any of the 480 million. So those are the things that we will look at over the next number of months again, and we're constantly working on this to find out ways in which the engineers and the accountants come together to reduce the cost, but ultimately get to the objective, which is passing and connecting all these premises. So that's answering the first question. In terms of other countries that do clawback, the system we're applying here is the same across every member state in Europe. It is required under state aid guidelines. So the guidelines set out specifically, which in the European Commission's view would be legally binding on member states, is you must put in clawbacks in your contracts. You must put in clawbacks wherever possible that you can, because it's so difficult to predict the future in terms of the cost of passing, connecting, or the cost of regulatory prices, or the demand of the network. Now, what we've seen, and we've had many discussions with Broadband Delivery UK, so they're the authority in the UK that oversees all broadband delivery projects there on behalf of local authorities, and they would work with the European Commission the same way as the Department of Communication has in Ireland, and with their bidders over there and the industry over there, they would negotiate relevant clawback provisions. So again, it depends on a case by case and country by country what percentage clawback you get, and the clawback percentage that you achieve in the context of Ireland, we have a 60% clawback on excess profits. We have 100% clawback on any cost savings, on the majority of costs that they incur. As I said, for example, if they get cheaper fibre prices in the market, we only pay for the actual market price they achieve. We do not pay them subsidy in excess of that. So we effectively, if they've assumed €100 per metre for fibre, it turns out to be 70, we pay 70, they don't get the 30. So that's 100% clawback from what's in the bid at the moment. So clawback is not unique to us, it's standard across France, Germany, UK. In the UK, the most recent example would be where BT would have put in a bid. They would have gone very, very, very pessimistic on the amount of people that will use the network. It turned out again within 1 or 2 years that the demand went from 20% to 40% overnight, and the BD UK authority clawed back £700 million from what was initially agreed to be paid out in subsidy. And that's continually going on in every single authority over the UK. The most recent project, which will have similar clawback provisions, it's not concluded. In Scotland, the R100 is currently going through the same and similar process that we've gone through. They've actually gone with 3 lots, same way as we started. They've gone with a gap funding model, and the contract in terms of governance is quite similar to ourselves. In fact, they're probably following a very similar, same template as us, and have many of the same advisors on board that we've had. So it's not uncommon what we're doing here. In France, again, they have concession models in France and different local authorities, but they also rely very heavily on the contract provisions and the clawback provisions within the first 20-25 years. With any concession model, gap-funded model, it's the same standard form. Touching on the ESB before I get into with Pat, who's the technical expert on that front, in terms of what would you use with ESB networks versus Aircom's networks, or a tower and mast network if it was wireless. I suppose the initial engagement with an ESB networks type solution was when Cyro was at the table. Obviously, we were carried out 880 or more hours of dialogue with all bidders. So between mid-2016 and when Cyro left in August 2017, we would have gone through with many representatives from the ESB Networks team, engineers and accountants, what it meant to use the ESB network for rural Ireland. So we would have the benefit of a couple of hundred hours of talking through the challenges, the benefits, and all of those things, and Pat would have been at all those workshops. So we've got a very deep understanding of what it means to use the ESB network, and ESB Networks gave us all that detail in many presentations. Leading on to that, I suppose they left, and then as part of our, I suppose, contingency planning that we carried out in our reports, you'll see in all the documents in the latter part of 2018, again, we would have engaged with ESB in meetings and gone through things with them in terms of, again, the challenges and what's possible. And what's possible not only within any contingency plan, but within the current plan. Because again, the ESB network is absolutely open to the current bidder to use, where it's most cost effective to do so, and it's actually practically possible to do so. And another actor that's very important in that is the CRU, the Commission for Energy Regulation. Because again, they have to set the prices for access to that network. And we've engaged with them, and so is ESB Networks. And that engagement is ongoing as we speak. So that engagement is there to continue, and I suppose in terms of the technology piece, I'll hand over to Pat.
Yeah. It comes on itself. Yeah.
Sure, that's all right. Yeah, so just to cover the ESB infrastructure, I suppose it's probably important to say that while the MBI's bid is based on using the air and ENET infrastructure primarily, it absolutely still is an option to use the ESB infrastructure in due course during the rollout, and certainly that would be an option in certain instances, you know, where that infrastructure is the most appropriate or cost-effective infrastructure to use. So the MBI, as they're rolling out, prior to actually starting a build in any location, will do a detailed site survey of the area. They'll identify the existing infrastructure that is in existence and then come up with a detailed design that is the most cost efficient and appropriate for that particular area. So I think we've discussed before that they've chopped the country into lots of 110 deployment areas. So at that point they would identify what the most appropriate infrastructure is in the deployment area, and they then would propose and look for an authorisation to proceed to build from the department. I suppose at this point MBI certainly are engaging all infrastructure access owners to agree the processes by which they would use their infrastructure and the appropriate prices for the use of their infrastructure, including ESB. Fergal touched on it there that each infrastructure has its own challenges. We would have, through the bid process, got very familiar with the challenges surrounding the ESB infrastructure through the Cyro engagement, and they brought a number of ESB experts to the table to demonstrate that there are very stringent health and safety requirements to use the ESB infrastructure. They're very much governed by the primacy of the electricity network. So obviously the infrastructure is there to serve electricity customers in the first instance, so that has to be respected in any other infrastructure using or any other user using the same infrastructure. There's a number of physical barriers in using pole infrastructure and duct infrastructure from ESB in terms of they have a lot of equipment that is pole mounted, and each pole in itself is nearly a mini project in certain instances to use. And they have, I suppose, developed a process by which it can be used. To answer the question, can it be used? Absolutely. It is an option for MBI to pursue that, and they will. But as with other infrastructure, there are challenges to it. In terms of the overall engagements, yeah, we've examined the use of the infrastructure through the bid process with Zyro. We have bilaterally met ESB themselves to understand the products and processes by which they make their infrastructure available. And we've met with the CRU as well in terms of how the pricing would be determined and how any issues arising from I suppose the primacy of the electricity could be handled from their perspective.
Okay. I might go back to members of the committee. So I'll start with Deputy
Thanks very much, Chair. And kind of agreement is that we'd have a block of time to just have a dialogue with you. So I'll ask just ask a question and maybe get a response, and we'll work our way through it. Who's the bidder at the moment? Who's the person that the state has signed, or what's the entity that the state has made this preferred bidder status on? Who's that?
Yes, so the lead, the bid is led by Granahan McCourt, Dublin, Ireland Limited. I think we can maybe provide this in diagram format.
And who is, maybe just then kind of go vertical for me on that. Who or what is that? So that's the Irish company. There's a parent company somewhere to that, is there?
one or two while they're maybe getting the answer.
I'll wait because it's important.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, sure.
I need to ask one or two questions that might be of the same thread, just to give them a chance to get the answers together so that they can...
So the shareholders of National Broadband Ireland are, you have above them, there's a holding company, but the owner of the holding company is effectively Tetrad Corporation. And Granahan McCourt, it's not global, because that's another company people mentioned, it's Granahan McCourt Ireland, Dublin LLC is what it's called. Okay? Now, that one is owned by Frank McCourt, or not Frank, it's owned by David McCourt, 100%, and Walter Scott and his family own Tetrad Corporation. So, National Broadband Ireland, the company that the contract will be signed with, and the holding company that sits above that, is fully owned by David McCourt and Walter Scott between them. Okay?
By Granahan McCourt,
Dublin. Yeah, LLC.
Right.
And then Tetrad Corporation.
Tetrad Corporation.
Yeah.
So there's two entities, there's two investors effectively in the holding company, which in effect holds all the shares to NBI.
Yeah.
Now, there's just some confusion there over the last number of days, and there was a difference between two parliamentary questions that Barry Cowan and I asked. So McCourt Global LLC was mentioned on the 15th of May as being a shareholder, together with Tetrad and with Granahan McCourt. That was incorrect, I take it, because there was a subsequent response yesterday which didn't mention McCourt Global LLC, it just mentioned Granahan McCourt and Tetrad. So can I assume that between the 15th of May and the 21st of May that McCourt Global exited the scene?
No, the position is that McCourt Global and Tetrad Corporation, they were the two companies that the bidder relied upon to demonstrate its capacity to meet financial and economic criteria at the PQQ. You've heard that, the pre-qualification stage.
And when was that now? Can you give me when?
So that's going back to, that's before the final tender has been received.
So that's sometime in 2018?
In 2019. In 2019, there was a change in the makeup of the bidder that was formalised in advance of the final tender being received.
Yeah, that's important now, because I just want to zone in on that if I can.
Yeah.
Did that formal change take place in the month or two after the former minister met with David McCourt, who is Granahan McCourt's principal, and McCourt Global LLC, of which the principal is Frank McCourt? So, would it be true to say that the character of the bidder, the one bidder that was left, changed substantially within a month, perhaps two, of that event in New York?
No, the change that I'm referring to here happened, it concluded and was approved in September of 18, before the final tender was received.
Yeah.
That was
okay, September 18. So no,
yeah.
but I just
let Mr. Hoban finish if you want.
But I need to be particular about this. So,
okay, just let him finish a sentence. I'll let you back in again, because maybe he's going to answer your question for you.
The key element and the most significant aspect of that change, and this is generally in the public domain, but it was to give effect, it was in the public domain, is that you had other companies that had been involved at a previous stage and had exited the bid
SSE and John Lang and
in a very public manner, but in terms of but that change had to be given effect to through the PQQ process, and it went through that process, it conformed with that process, and when that change happened, the role of those two companies, this is the McCourt Global LLC and Tetrad, was that they were the two that were relied upon to demonstrate the capacity of the bidder to meet the financial and economic criteria of the PQQ. Okay. And importantly, both of them, they were assessed separately, and either of them would have been sufficient for them to become qualified.
Okay, but what I want to get back to is an event took place between the former minister and a number of officials from your department in or about the summer, I don't have the exact date, but in or about the summer of 2018. There was a discussion at that meeting, which was minuted, which talks about the make-up or the potential change in the consortium. Now, Frank McCourt, McCourt Global LLC, of McCourt Global LLC, was present. Subsequently, his company is relied on to act as a guarantor or allows to assist Granahan McCourt, David McCourt, still being effectively a qualifying bidder. Now, I have to ask you, because the process auditor who did an investigation of this, to the best of my recollection, never interviewed Frank McCourt, assumed, perhaps, I don't know, assumed that he just happened to be having lunch with his brother for the purpose of welcoming the minister to New York. I don't know. Bríd Smith didn't carry out any analysis of the presence of Frank McCourt at that meeting. Now, I just am at a loss to understand what the purpose of Frank McCourt being there was. You wouldn't have to be Einstein to figure out that soon afterwards he gives a letter of undertaking to his brother to get him to pass a certain milestone within the broadband process. Now, I don't know that that looks great, to be honest with you. I certainly think there's an issue there, because David McCourt's company, Granahan McCourt, start out a process way back. It changes in character and nature almost on a monthly basis. There's people in, I mean, Lanigan's Ball. There's companies in, there's companies out. And there's different points then to which he relies on the financial strength or ability of another company that allows him to progress a stage further. And then his brother says, "You're on your own. I got you this far." Like, do you not think that that raises very serious questions about the capacity of the company that you have decided to grant preferred bidder status on? You then take that to a point where the risk, we understand that the risk being taken by all concerned, we understand that the risk being taken by all concerned now is 175 billion of capital investment. The Taoiseach in the Dáil today told us that that's actually been put in by Tetrad. So David McCourt, the actor all along the way here of Granahan McCourt, isn't putting in any money. So we've had this company coming all the way through, bringing different people with him, you know, potentially providing money. And now it turns out that he's found a company, but it's not his company. The state, in my view, is still carrying all the risk here. So that's what could you confirm that the 175 million of capital is coming from Tetrad? Was the Taoiseach clear on that today? Okay. And I suppose another question, we talked about that holding company there. Is Tetrad a shareholder of that? Is Tetrad a shareholder of the holding company? And is it held equally with Granahan McCourt? Now, even though we understand all the capital is coming from Tetrad, what's their share of the ownership of the holding company?
Yeah, and I can confirm in terms of that they are a shareholder. I think, as I indicated to the Chair, we will provide this in the form of a diagram that might be helpful, that you actually have it in front of you to engage on it. I'll make a couple of comments. You reference back to a meeting which the note of the meetings in the public domain from last year, so and a process that has been dealt with. I don't propose to comment further. In terms of, and I do need to deal with this, in terms of referencing the capacity of the bidder. Okay. The capacity of the bidder has been clearly established through the evaluation process, right through the procurement. To get through the gates of this procurement process, there was a very, very detailed criteria. There were five parties applied to come through the gates of the process, and 3 of them were qualified. For those 3 parties to remain in that process, if there were any changes within their bid, they had to revisit and go through the pre-qualification test again. Where there have been changes in bids in this process, they have gone through that process. It's been evaluated in accordance with the rules of the procurement and have been found and they were approved. And then, most importantly, the final tender received went through an extensive, rigorous evaluation. And the conclusion of that was, the first conclusion coming from that, which allowed for the decision the government took earlier this month, was that the bid had been evaluated as meeting all of the requirements of that procurement. Then there was a bigger decision to be taken around moving ahead with the project and the cost, etc. But by coming through that evaluation, it is a categoric assertion that this entity that's sitting there before us today, that is the preferred bidder in the National Broadband Plan procurement process, has met all of the requirements of the procurement process at PQQ stage and at final tender stage. In terms of the 2 companies that you've referenced there, again, I think it's very important that at the PQQ stage, where the financial resources of the McCourt Global Company reference and Tetrad, they were both assessed by the department's team and our advisors, and the conclusion was that either of them would have stood the test if they were the sole party to have allowed the bid to proceed through the PQQ. And then at final tender, while they both provided letters of support, it's Tetrad that provided the commitment to the 175 million of equity, and it's Granahan McCourt, not the McCourt Global, Granahan McCourt that will be providing the working capital. Okay. And that is information which the Minister has been very clear on in responding to parliamentary questions in the House this week, and I understand that the Taoiseach also referred to.
So what's the breakdown of the ownership of the holding company?
Yeah. That's. I said I'll come back. I'll come back with that in. I think in the form of a diagram to confirm that.
Okay, we'll move on to the next couple of questions if I can. It should be quicker. Just in relation to the ownership model, the gap funding model. So back in 2015, there were 5 elements looked at. And in fairness, I think if you go through the work of KPMG and PwC at the time, it seemed like a good option when you look at the pros and cons. You know, on the pro side, cheapest overall, lowest level of subsidy required up front, minimises state exposure to risk, all good stuff. Now, so that went with the gap funding model. Hard to disagree with it at the time. But when CSIRO pulled out, when AIR pulled out, I'm at a loss to understand how within your project team, within the department generally, you didn't go back and revisit the ownership model, recognising that all the pros had effectively evaporated, how it still made sense to go with the gap funded model. And I think you would now have to accept, with the passage of the 20 months since that began, and you're now taking on all the risk, you're taking, you know, the state has to carry all the burden of risk here with the 3 billion, that it was a bad decision not to have re-evaluated the situation then. So just maybe get your view on that.
Yeah. Thanks, Deputy. I think, Chair, if we were here solely dealing with that issue this afternoon, we could, you know, we could spend a huge amount of time around it because it is a very complex issue. When I say complex, what I mean is that it is not one of those black and white issues. Clearly, there are pros and cons for either of the models, and as circumstances change, I wouldn't agree with the analysis that the pros have evaporated.
Could you give me one pro first?
We will absolutely. But the complexity of it as such is that the pros, they change. Some of them actually remain at the core. I mean, maybe we can usefully address that. But there was a reappraisal at a point in time where we were at a single bidder. Because, yeah, I fully accept that you challenge the department and say, you know, if the question is, did you not look at and fundamentally assess, was this the right, were you on track, should you continue? And the answer is we did. I mean, we tend not to come outside of the front door to set out what it is we're doing. But when we're inside of that door, we're absolutely asking these questions of ourselves, and we'll talk through the process, but we're confident with the outcome that we got to, that it was the right outcome, and the analysis is still the right analysis.
Okay. So you mentioned what are the pros now that we're in a single bidder situation. I suppose it does go back to the heart of the risk and the shared risk of whatever model you would have chosen. So yes, 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, it's been a long road and there's been many changes. As Kieran said, we did engage KPMG and Lawless and the whole team looked in. The minute Eircom left the process, we all got into the rooms straight away and we looked at what's the options here across the board. Stop, start.
Can I just ask you one point there, if I could, Chair? You said KPMG. Wasn't it KPMG that first suggested that the gap funding model was the best model? So you got KPMG then to reassess the situation at a later stage?
And they published a report, which, again, it's up to the department to review, and all the other people that we have at the table, steering groups and everything else, to review reports. So when it transpires, so when it transpires that what KPMG had suggested up front didn't really work out, the pros that they had identified failed to materialise. Well, can I go through them?
Then, but then the point I'd make to you is, so you got KPMG to come back. Yeah. It'll hardly be a surprise now that KPMG
we'll just let Mr. Mulligan answer the question, and I'll let you back in again, Deputy.
If we can just go through, why does it work? I mean, we wouldn't be sitting here if we didn't think the gap funding model didn't work. So I'll just take you through, because there's loads of reports, but I'll just take you through 6 points that I'd just like to articulate. The gap funding model, we believe, still achieves the policy objective. The policy objective here is to get people in rural Ireland and other parts of Ireland high-speed broadband. The gap-funded model and the solution we have at the table achieves that objective, in our view. And the contract that we will have in place by the time it's signed will ensure that objective is met with the rigour and the oversight so that these guys deliver. So In terms of where your starting point is, what are you trying to achieve? You're trying to achieve a policy objective of ubiquitous high-speed broadband, and regardless of which model you're going to choose, but the gap-funded model achieves that objective. Whether it's a concession model, I'd assume that would achieve the same objective. The gap-funded model, after Eircom left and before Eircom left, would achieve that same objective. So, I think the question you're asking is, and this is what some commentators say, well, maybe the gap-funded model was on the premise of two things: competition in the process, and it was much, much cheaper. The premise for the decision wasn't on those two things. The premise was for, as you see in the 2015 consultation and the reports, and in the reappraisal report, was a wide array of things that were taken on the round as to which was the most appropriate model. So the policy objective is your starting point. The gap-funded model, similar to a concession, supports all the state aid and market requirements that you require. It is a wholesale open access network, fully regulated with products, fully regulated with prices, and it allows for effective competition at the retail level. But both models do that. So the gap-funded model is a very positive model in terms of state aid requirements, but also the market requirements, which is akin to what Comreg tried to achieve, again, with private operators that it regulates, such as Eircom. And that is all in the premise, and all these points will be all in the premise, and my finishing point will be on the basis of appropriate governance. So all of this is absolutely weighted to the appropriate governance model being in place from day one for 25 years. So everything has got that big health warning on it that whatever model you would have chosen, you must have appropriate governance from the department or whatever the department decides to do in the future with an agency. So that's absolutely fundamental to any of these thoughts.
So just
one of the key points.
I'll
Sorry, I've
just
just 6 points, Deputy. I'll just go through the 6
yeah.
points because, as I said, it could come up with 40, but there's just 6 important ones. We also believe it is important to give an incentive to the private sector to run this business as efficiently as possible, to be the ones that are dealing face-to-face with Eircom and ENET and the 40 subcontractors that they are going to have to employ. No matter what model you've chosen here, you have to get your infrastructure provider, you have to get the builders of the network, you have to get an operate company. We chose a design, build, manage and operate model. We still believe that the most efficient way to run this is an integrated model where the operate company is working with the build company, and it's better that they're working together as opposed to having 2 contracts with 2 separate companies that will be pulling and tugging off each other for the next 25 years. So again, that was a critical point where you're creating an incentive for these guys to be efficient because they will want to maximise profits. And we would hope they will make profits because then the project is successful, the policy objective has been achieved, and we will get 60% clawback. So those are obviously objectives that we have, and we hope the private sector has the same objectives. We believe it does protect the public interest because we have the protections I mentioned in place on the 3 factors of passing, connecting and renting infrastructure, where the public purse is protected, with the governance process in place, with effective regulation from Comreg, and all the different things we have in place in the contract in terms of accounting and oversight. We believe it's achievable in the short term. It doesn't require you to start a new process and kick the can down another 2 or 3 years before you start. That's not a key determinant, but it's an important factor in terms of everybody wants this to be happening quickly. We believe this model does that, but does it in an appropriate fashion. We're not doing this just because it works now and we have 2 or 3 years to wait. It works now because of the things I've outlined. And we do believe it brings in an appropriate allocation of risk. People say there's no risk on this private sector. This private sector has a mammoth task to build a network over the next 7 years. They will have to set up the project management office and manage the Make Ready programme with Eircom, which they've been at for the last year and a half, and they have a very good process already set up. They have engineers that have worked in Eircom for 40 years, working with engineers that have worked in Eircom for 30 years, and they're working very well together. So they have all the people in place and they have the systems in place. But they will take the risk that Eircom goes slower. They will take the risk that demand isn't as quickly or isn't coming onto the network as quickly as they would have thought. And they're taking the risk for operating the company from year 10 to 25 and up to year 35. Okay, so there is an allocation of risk there in the context of they really need to make this work.
So 2 things on risk.
I'm going to take you back in at the end and just take note of your point.
And if it doesn't work, because we have looked at every eventuality here of what happens if this doesn't work. Every contract has to have that eventuality. The schools had to have that eventuality because Carillion didn't work out. You have to have that in every public contract. So we have that in spades in our contract where if these guys, for some reason, fail during the design or the build or the operate in all areas of it, what happens? And we can step in to take back the asset or the business, depending on how appropriate it is to either at any given time, without bringing more risk onto the state.
Taking all the risk onto the state.
Let him finish.
Not if it's not appropriate to do so. So,
But with
that's what I'm
respect,
saying, you can make those decisions.
No, with respect now, Mr. Mulligan, you said at the outset that you looked at everything in the context of the policy, which is to get broadband to the people. So surely you're not suggesting that some government or some department at a later stage, in an effort to mitigate the risk to the state, would abandon the project.
Exactly.
So the truth of it is, if you're to follow that through, all the risk falls back. So what I want to know on the risk side is, and this needs to go back, as I was just looking at a PQ while you were talking there, in response to a PQ there on the 15th of May, the response was that the holding company will be wholly owned by Granahan McCourt Dublin Limited, subject to the Minister's special share. That doesn't seem to suggest that Tetrad has any ownership in the holding company. And I'm not being niggly about this, but it goes back to who's carrying the risk. And if the only risk that's being put in here, or the only risk that's being carried, is the initial 175 million of 175 million of equity that's put in, that doesn't give me much confidence to go to year 10, 12, 15 and onwards, because if you go back to the memo which was circulated by Secretary General Watt back as part of the documents that you released, he makes it clear that all that money will be paid back to Granahan McCourt or Tetrad or whoever is the beneficial owner of it within 8 years. And that's before a lot of the people have actually signed up. So what I'm trying to figure out is, will there be any purpose for Mr McCourt or his myriad of companies to remain around after year 10? Because they'll have already gotten their money.
Okay.
So the concern I have is, which tends to undermine the reason why you're still following the GAP model, is the state's carrying all the risk.
Okay, I'm going to let Mr Mulligan back in, because you're in the middle of your points there, and you can address those questions as well.
So I think I'll address that point about this notion that he might be fully paid back by a certain date. I mean, well, frankly, we hope that this is successful. We hope the design, the build and the operate is a success. We obviously do. Now, if everything is an absolute roaring success, well then, like any equity put into any company, the equity providers would be entitled to take their money back with a rate of return. That's what Mr Watt would have said, which is, if it all happens, if he is successful in rolling out for 540,000 premises and connecting them on time and meeting all the KPIs and meeting all the milestones that he has to meet, which is for 10 years a very significant burden on any private operator to meet every single part of our contract. If he does that, and I hope I'm sitting here in 10 years' time to say he has done that, well then I think he's entitled to take money back out that he's put back in. If he does not meet those requirements, he will have two choices. And the main choice he'll have is to put more equity in. If there's less customers in year 4 or 5, he will have to make up the equity if there's a cash flow shortfall. He will not be getting more subsidy. So the amount of equity of 175 million, well, in year 6 or 7, who knows what that might be in terms of what more equity they will have to put into the company they've set up to avoid us stepping in. And don't forget, we have a choice. If he has 200 people or 150 people there working in a company, we won't be starting from scratch. We have the choice, not the obligation, the choice to take that company, as long as it's appropriate to do so, and keep everything going, because we will have not paid, the majority, a lot of the subsidy will not have been paid at different checkpoints. We only pay, so there's 110 deployment areas. If 40 of them are delivered by, say, year 4, 40 areas of the country are delivered and the network is built for 40 areas. Yes, we will take that 40 areas and we will keep it going with the operate company that's there. Or we'll have a choice to do it differently. But I'd assume that the operate company is working the way it should be working, with the experts and the people in place. It's just maybe that he's run out of money.
So for clarity then, are you saying that the only returns to the bidder come based on certain milestones being achieved in terms of performance Or is it just a straight line over a certain number of years that there's a return made on an annual basis regardless of performance?
Absolute performance. He has to achieve the strict criteria set out in detail in the contract.
Now, does that relate to sign-up of customers, or does it just is it just relating to the performance of passing the homes?
Everything. Performance of designing the network, performance of passing the network, performance of connecting customers, and performance of operating the network.
But for talk's sake, worst case scenario, nobody signs up. Or a very low percentage, less than 20%, which would be the standard start off. Is there still a potential for him to have achieved the vast bulk of his milestones based on rolling out the network, designing it in the first instance, passing the premises as set out, etc.?
Well, if a business doesn't have any customers, doesn't have any money.
I think on that point that I mean, there has been, and I suppose it's in terms of looking at risk. We've looked at the risk at both ends of this. We've looked at the risk in terms of if this thing went very badly, what's the potential cost of protecting the cost of the state. That's why we took the approach we took in terms of contingent subsidy and having a max cap subsidy. On the other side, we've looked and said, but what if this thing was very successful and if the take-up is as fast and as high as, I think, as we in the department would be positive about this project, and we're looking at what's happening in urban areas, we're looking at what happened. We have the figures for the Air 300k and we can't share them, and there's a frustration there, I suppose, because sometimes there's figures thrown out that are below those figures. I'm not going to say which ones are below those figures, but everything we're seeing in the market is suggesting that we will not be looking at the worst case scenario, and we will be somewhere in the mid case towards the positive scenario. And in terms of how the contract is structured, it has to protect against both of those, the very positive or the very negative. But the governance is heading you towards the place where you're expecting to be, which is in that mid case.
Can I move to Deputy Stanley? Thank you. Yeah, Deputy Stanley. Thank you very much, Deputy Stanley.
Thanks. Well, I suppose the process we've been trying to follow it for the past 3 years and trying to read what's going on behind the scenes. And I have to say that the last week or two we have seen some startling revelations. And what we're being told publicly by ministers, etc., that doesn't match up with what was actually going on behind the scenes, some of which we suspected. Could I ask a question in relation to the governance? I want to try and keep the answers short because of a number of questions, and you'll appreciate this is the first real opportunity we've had to ask some of these questions. In relation to the board of NBI, that there would be 9 representatives on it. We were presented with a diagram the other morning over in the department with a briefing with officials. One of those will represent the minister and the taxpayer. One of those. The taxpayer is putting up to 2.95 million. According to the Taoiseach today, Tetra is putting up 175, and they've only come into play in recent days, from what we've been told about in recent days, because this entity has changed numerous times over the period I've been following it over the past 3 years. And McCourt, as far as I can ascertain, is putting in maximum of 45 million working capital. And if the taxpayer is putting in up to 2,950 million, right, and has one representative on the board, I don't know, maybe you've been a member of a committee at some time or another, a resident association or a sporting club, and I don't mean this in a smart way, but you'll always know that at a committee meeting, that if there's 9 people at the table, that if it comes down to a decision to be made, that normally if there's a vote taken and there's 8 people representing the interests of the private investor who is putting in whatever amount of money, 45 million, 175 million, and on the other hand there's one person representing the taxpayer, the 4.7 million of us that inhabit this state, and there's one person representing them, do you feel that the governance model, a brief answer to it, is sufficient to ensure that our interests, the interests of the government, the Oireachtas and the taxpayer, is being provided for there?
Okay, thanks very much, Deputy. I'll try to be very brief at a high level, and I'll ask Fergal Mulligan to come in some more detail.
Just need a pretty straightforward question.
Yeah, and I fully understand the point about the one member. I have been involved on committees. I've got the scars on my back from 9 years chairing a GA club on the north side of Dublin, and I understand that. The Minister appointed to the board is just one of a suite of governance measures. I think that's important, and that the board itself then has only one purpose in life, which is to deliver on this contract that they've signed with the Minister. But it's one part of a suite. We have a 1,500-page contract which has a suite of governance measures, and that is where the key controls are for the Minister.
Yeah, again, briefly, you have to go back to the starting point. In other countries, these contracts can tend to be awarded to large groups. For example, in the UK, they're awarded to BT or Orange Telecom or Deutsche Telekom or similar. We set out on this journey in 2015 where we clearly set out in the strategy and in the procurement documents, you must set up a ring-fenced, standalone, special-purpose vehicle which would be dedicated to this project. So therefore, the Minister's appointee, while it's a really important person to have on the board, the overall board, be it 5 or 7 or 9 people, their sole responsibility is to the delivery of the contract for the Minister and will report to the contract regularly. They are not like other group companies that you would have across Europe or even in Ireland.
They're there appointed by, because I asked you this over at the private meeting in the department the other day. They're there and they're appointed by the consortium, right? If they're appointed by the consortium, they are there to represent the interests of the consortium. And if I was part of that consortium and I was putting on 8 representatives onto it, or you are, you'd be very, very clear who they were representing and who they were reporting back to. And that entity, NBI, is flawed because of that. That is my firm belief. I get no pleasure of pointing out this to you. That structure is flawed from the point of view of the taxpayer and the state and protecting the interests of the taxpayer. Because 8 and 1, you know, the balance of power on that board is overwhelmingly weighted in favour of the investor. Can you just move on to in terms of the risk? In terms of risk to the taxpayer, that the Secretary General of DEPR, the Department of Public Expenditure, Department of Finance, he described it, the risk, as a leap of faith. Brendan Ellison, the Secretary General of the Department, the Principal Officer, my apologies, he strongly recommended against it. And we see this in the documents being released. The Department of Public Expenditure called into question the financial and technical ability to deliver the project, right? And today we learn, and this is, Deputy Dooley referred back to where it started. It actually started way back before that, because ENET were there. It was ENET was the company who was into bidding, and then McCourt entered. And now we've had all these changes since. SSE pulled out, John Lang pulled out, all of the other ones pulled out that were part of that consortium. And now we hear that there's this other investor. I can just ask you this, that the Taoiseach this morning said there's 175 million being put up by Tetra. Is that written into the contract, or has that money been lodged in an account? Or is that simply an A4 sheet of paper, a letter of comfort from an entity called Tetra to say that we will commit this to the project? Can you just clarify that for me?
It's contractual. That 175,
because he mentioned the letter.
Yeah, that 175 will be given effect through the National Broadband Plan contract, so it'll be contractualised.
I'm asking you what you have at this stage from McCourt, from Granahan and McCourt, and from the consortium in terms of guarantees that that money is there. Is it just a letter of commitment that you have?
It's a commitment letter, yes.
And that's all you have?
You're asking what? Is the money in the bank? Is that what you're asking?
Is it written into the contract? Is it written into the contract, that guarantee?
It will be provided for in the contract.
Is it at this point? Today, is that written into the contract? Into the draft documents?
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, Deputy, the contract isn't signed.
No, I know it's not, but it is written into look, you're drafting it.
I suppose what I'll say to you is, in terms of any tender process, because we're not doing anything different here to normal tender process, the tender process that they had to get through in terms of that gatepost had significant requirements in terms of the financial support and whatever else they had to provide in terms of guarantees that the money will be there before a contract signed by the Minister. So depending on when a contract is signed, the money will be in a bank and will be absolutely contractualised before a minister has to sign a contract.
So we have a very complex process.
Yeah.
From the diagram that you produced the other day.
Yep.
It's overseen by a board.
Yep.
Of NBI, yep. Which is one representative representing us, the taxpayer on it.
Yep.
Right? And we have a letter. The only thing we have from a private investor is a letter of commitment at this point in time, this far on in the process. 3 years into it. Okay?
Respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, the whole point to it is that until you got to a position where the government was able to indicate to the bidder in the process that we want to get to contract close, we want to actually award a contract to you, you won't get those kind of contractual positions. It won't be in a contract. It can only be at the point where you have the contract signed. So what we went through a procurement process. In the procurement process, we needed to know that the financial standing was there. We needed to know that the equity, that there was equity to be invested, the amount of that equity. We needed to know who was committing it, and we received all that. And then you give effect to that in the contract. I think it's an entirely appropriate way to proceed.
But try to remember you lads. I remember you lads and ministers telling us that you had John Lang on board and SSE and all the firepower that was behind this, all the financial firepower. And now it's all evaporated like a ball of smoke. What we're left with now is that we have a letter from a new company that we're only hearing about this week. That's the facts.
Well, in terms of that, I don't know.
That's okay. Can we just move on? Because
do you want to answer that?
Yeah, it's not a new company you're only hearing about this week. And I mean, the department, we've been with another committee, in fairness, the Public Accounts Committee, and we've referenced who was putting money into this project and before. But it is in the context, I mean, you've mentioned other companies that had an interest in the National Broadband Plan procurement, who participated in that, who came through the gates in it. But at the end of the day, we can only deal with the companies that actually came forward and submitted the final tender and are now seeking to sign a contract. And that's what we have before us.
And there's 2 companies pulled out in 2017, you remember that? And after that, you drew up 2 contingency plans, your department. Can you just move on to that? In your opening statement, you pointed out that your department did investigate the need for a Plan B. And your department published 2 contingency reports, one in 18 and one in 2019. Both reports concluded that there were viable state-led alternatives that could deliver high-speed broadband in rural Ireland. Could you please outline to the committee the strengths of each of those state-led alternatives which your department concluded were viable? And just on that in the contingency report you referenced those. You said in the 2019 one, on page 1 of that the report states that, and I quote, that a significantly more robust and thorough analysis would be required before the preferred Plan B approach could be confirmed. And could you tell the committee whether this thorough analysis was ever carried out, or whether there was a cost-benefit analysis commissioned by the department on the Plan B now, on the Plan B options? And if that happened, and if it didn't happen, why didn't it happen?
Yeah. Just to step back, first of all, I mean, I won't attempt to, Chair, go into the detail of all of the contingency options, because they're in quite detailed reports that have been published. We're happy to if you want to drill down on specific questions on individual options, happy to do so. But that was a process that the 2018 process, first and then 19, there was extensive engagement internally in our own department and with the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, where we were looking at, in the context of, if this procurement process ended without a successful outcome for any reason, where would we go? And then at a later stage, when we actually had a final tender in and we understood that it could be delivered, but we also understood what the cost was at that point, to look again and to see where would that bring you. So there was extensive analysis, and across the analysis there were a number of common themes, and the first was that taking any of these, and there were options that you could proceed with in the event that Plan A did not go ahead. But for any of them, the very first thing you would have to do is you have to go back effectively to the drawing board and consult on the strategy. And then you need a decision. You need to publish a new strategy and a way forward. No matter which option you took, whether you took one that was going to depend entirely on the market, or one which there was a number of options which were around the establishment of a state agency. If it was a state agency one, well, then you need to. We don't have a state telecoms agency. You have to establish that and build it up. And the obvious starting point would be to look at the resources that are there. It's a small team within the department, and try to build on from that. But that of itself would take a certain amount of time, and you would expect that there would be a legislative element involved there. But then you would need to go back to the market, no matter what model you took. So time was certainly an issue. In the context of that, and the Minister answered questions on this in the House yesterday around a cost-benefit analysis for those alternatives. I mean, it would not be possible today, and I would challenge anybody today who said that they could do a meaningful cost-benefit analysis on any of those options, because you're too early in the process for them. So at this point in time, today, when you take those options, when you allow that you have to consult on a strategy and you've got, the amount of time you lose there, where you've ended the current process, the first thing is, what would the scope of an intervention area be? Would it be 540, or what would have changed by the time you had moved on that strategy? And then, you have to be open if you consult on a new strategy to different approaches, and that could affect it. You would have to consult with the market in terms of the infrastructure that would be used, because that was central to the procurement process that we've just come through as to the two main networks that are there. If you go for fixed infrastructure, for fixed line infrastructure of the air network and the ESB network, or to what degree somebody might come forward with a press for a more of a mobile solution. So until you have clarity around the scope of the area, the nature of the technology, and the scope affects the revenues and the timing, because again, if you some of those options we looked at were to do a project very similar to the current project, but just to do it over a longer period, and what the impact of that would be on your revenues. So until you could actually lock down those factors, any, investing money in a CBA would be meaningless.
Could I ask a relevant question in relation to that? The model you picked, we now know requires a subsidy to subsidise the rental of the poles to the tune of 1 billion. 0.9, Minister said 1 billion, you said 0.9 billion here, 0.9 billion here today, 900 million over 25 years to rent. And if the ESB model was used, that infrastructure is already in place. So that 1 billion, out of the almost 3 billion subsidy from the taxpayer, there's already 1 billion of that will be gone in the model you're going to use, that will go to the company called Air, which was purchased by a French investor about 2 years ago. Okay. Correct?
No,
almost 1 billion. Is that correct?
I don't understand that analysis, Deputy.
Oh, no, I'm asking a straight question.
No, well,
is that correct? 1 billion.
The figure that's called out there, which is close to 1 billion, right? Of that, Eircom is allowed a return on its investment, and it's somewhere around it's 8.2%. So if you do the maths on that, 90+% of that money is to meet the cost of keeping that infrastructure in place. So what you're paying for there is the fact that poles need to be replaced, that all of the costs of operating a network over 100,000 kilometres of road in rural Ireland. So this is not money for jam. This is money where you get a rate of return set by Comrig, and Comrig can change that rate of return at the pole price. But on the basis of the model that we have before us, it's 8% of that money is the return to Air on its investment in that network. The rest of it is meeting the cost. The ESB would have costs of maintaining a network equally.
Could I make you aware of something? The ESB network is in very good condition, right? Their pole structures and their ducting. Air, if you drive around the country, a lot of their stuff has fallen over into ditches, right? The poles. And there's been very little investment in it since it was privatised back in 1999 in that basic infrastructure. Air have got the 300,000 easiest to reach, most profitable households that banjacks this process, right? And we'll come to that in a minute. The second thing is this, that they needed out of it. They needed an investment and a subsidy to modernise and to repair their pole and ducting network throughout the state, in every county, right? And now they have it. They have it in the form of the 0.9 of a billion or the 1 billion that they're now going to get over the next 25 years. So well done to Air. Could you just say, in relation to the contingency, and thanks to the taxpayer for that, I'm sure they'll be happy with it. In relation to the contingency, In your opening statement, you pointed out that the department, in relation to the Plan B, okay, and you set out your position on that. But in 2018 and 19, the department produced the 2 contingency reports, right, of which outlined the alternative models, right. Could you tell the committee at what point, right, or date, a decision was taken to produce those contingency reports? And could you also tell the committee why you felt the need at that point in 2018 and again in 19 to produce them? Because I asked the question because the decision by the government to go with the gap funding model was actually made in 2016, and yet there was no contingency report, or seemingly no need to drop contingency reports until 2 and 3 years later. And you know, was it only in 2017 that the government realised that, you know, the whole project maybe was in a more precarious state, following AIR taking away the 300,000 easiest to reach and most commercially lucrative households? Was that why there was is that the reason for the timing, and is that the reason that there was contingency reports drawn up in 2018 and 19? Because at that point, looking at it from outside, Mr. Hoban, looking at it from outside that's all we could do, and try and figure out what was going on behind the scenes. It looked to me, and I said it to the Minister publicly in the Chamber, and I said it to him privately outside the Chamber, that I believe that the whole process at that point was fatally undermined and banjaxed.
I can give you a short answer and a clear answer on the question. The 300k and the changing of the map, that was in April of 2017.
That's correct.
The engagement around the 2018 contingency report work, that commenced, it was mid-2018, and the key, I mean, the key factor influencing that piece of work was the fact that we were in a single bidder situation. We had earlier in the year carried out a project reappraisal, which led us in the direction of continuing with the procurement process, but notwithstanding that, it was determined that it would be useful to carry out contingency planning. Then the second element of it, the 2019, as I alluded to earlier, what again triggered that was when we were at the point in time where the evaluation of the final tender has reached the point where we understand what we have by the way of a bid and we understand the cost. And we have to be realistic about it and say that here was a very big decision government is going to make in this space, and that in advance of that to look and say, in the event that you were not to proceed, what else might you do?
And was the fact that the former minister was meeting, you know, numerous meetings with the representatives of the consortium at that stage and the main investor, who we thought was the main investor, David McCourt, at that point, wasn't that the case that the whole process was in a very, very precarious state, and you know, obviously McCourt had to be kept in the game because it was only show in town at that stage, and was it not the case at that point that it looked like the whole house of cards could collapse?
The driver for the reports, I can absolutely unequivocally say, the driver for the reports was the fact that the government, the civil service, it was doing its job in terms of looking at a significant major project, looking at the place you're at in the context of that, and understanding that you've got to do this kind of deep analysis of what your alternatives will be if you find yourself needing those alternatives, not the point in which a decision will be taken or something lands on you.
One simple question.
Yeah, we want to wrap. Are you nearly finished?
Just in relation, one question. Just in relation to the money end of things. We started out with a benchmark of 800 million, 0.8 billion for this. And the Minister stood up in the Chamber week after week telling us that was going to cover fibre to every home and every farm and every business in the state. Now it's been clarified that government and the department moved away from that. But even though it's not going to be fibre to every home, and we don't know how many homes it won't go to, we've now gone to 2.95 of a subsidy. And I just find it amazing, and I know, you know, that politicians will sometimes reject the advice of civil servants at either local level or national level, and we've all had bits of arguments with civil servants either at local government level and at national level, and I've had them as well, and I've disagreed with them on occasions. But could I ask you this, The memo, there's a memo here, the 3rd of the 4th, 2019, from Brendan Ellison in the Department of Finance. And he says that, however, we strongly recommend against approval of the appointment of a preferred bidder to the current NBP procurement process on the grounds of cost and affordability, impact on the NDP and on projects forgone as a result. And we know there's a list there of those, schools and other infrastructure projects, value for money, and specifically uncertain benefits, unprecedented risk, very strong language, to the Exchequer, and compatibility with spatial objectives in Project Ireland 2040. Now that to me, and that's just one quote, I mean, those documents are littered with statements like that. Absolutely, you know, Mr. Watson, the department, says in another document, he says, I want to again reiterate my gravest concerns about all of this, and he outlines.
I just want to give them a chance.
In the department, what I'm concerned about is that, are you certain and sure, despite, you know, that you should go against all of this advice and plough on with this, despite the advice of the people in public expenditure who are charged with looking after the state finances? Are you sure that you're on certain financial grounds with this? Because the public looking in at it, and a lot of us looking in at it, particularly over the last 10 days or so, you know, feel that the costs haven't shut up, the nature of the investors and who the investors are haven't changed dramatically, and the amount being put in, because we're being given to believe for a long time that it would be a 50-50 split. That was certainly the impression, if it wasn't said explicitly, that if the taxpayer put in $1 billion, that the investor would put in $1 billion or $500 million each. But why here we are in a situation where the main investor would now be putting in maybe 45 million.
Thank you. I'm going to let the officials come back in.
Okay, yeah, I mean, if a relatively short response, Deputy. I think it would be a very dull world if we were all in agreement at official and political level all of the time, and it is not the case. And there has been really significant engagement between the two key departments here, our own department and the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, right throughout this process, and that continues. It's what you'd expect. And it's somewhat of an accident as a civil servant as to which department you find yourself working in, and in fact which area of the department that you find yourself working in. So you've pointed to some material which is the public domain, and I think that's, you know, it's a really positive aspect of the decision making and the National Broadband Plan that so much information has been put into public domain. It doesn't necessarily always help in terms of the discourse because there is so much material there, but key documents and key engagements here are critical. And I would point also then to the letter from the Secretary-General of my own department in responding to the Secretary-General of the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, where he at great length goes through all of the issues that are raised, and the conclusion of that is in effect that the analysis of the civil servants in the Department of Communications, Climate Action and the Environment is that this project is the right project. It can be recommended to government, and so there was a disagreement across points between departments. But this department is not an evangelist who's promoting the digital agenda or connectivity. We have a responsibility to provide policy advice or implementation of projects in this space. And in bringing that critical analysis and taking the advice that we've had available to us, the experts on our own team and externally, we've come to a very clear conclusion, and the Secretary-General has himself in committee here articulated that. And his letter of the 24th of April, I think, is a really, really good document that should be accessed by people who want to understand the position of the department in the matter.
I can follow on that, Mr. Hoban, because I wanted to ask my questions based primarily around those two letters. One first from Robert Watt on the 16th of April, and then the response from the Secretary-General in the Department of Communications on the Mark Griffin on the 24th, as you say. And I'd have to say, maybe first by way of introduction, that ordinarily you say that it's pure accident which side of that line one might be on. I would always be on the side of the Department of Communications, maybe just from my own past experience as a minister in that department. And generally, I would take a dim view at most of the advice from the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, because as sure as eggs are eggs, they'll tell you we shouldn't be investing in digital or in renewable or in... They would have an instinctive desire to protect the public purse and would be sceptical of most initiatives coming from some of the line departments. So my initial response when I heard that the Department of Public Expenditure were concerned, well, I said, well, that's what you'd expect them to be. But what I am concerned about, not so much their opposition to the fundamental strategic decision to invest in fibre to the home, which I believe is the right one. It's long-term ambitious. But when they're concerned about the rate of return to the private developer, which would not be their normal modus operandi, and when they're concerned about transfer of ownership to the private sector, which again goes completely against their traditional outlook on the world, then I really sit bolt upright and take notice. Why is it that the Department of Public Expenditure is, and they're not used to me using exaggerated language, they coach things in very subtle ways ordinarily, but their warnings in this regard are very stark. Can I ask just a couple of questions? In that letter response from Mark Griffin on the 24th of April, just at the very end of it, there's a small detail that the department itself will incur a €10 million a year cost to maintain the team within the department to oversee the project. I presume that 10 million is not included in the other project costs that we've already been itemised, that's in a sense a separate cost of this whole project. Is that correct?
The cost of the governance hasn't been factored into the budget, and as the Secretary-General points out there, the expectation there is that the Department would engage in the normal recourse of the estimates with the Department of Public Expenditure around that, but put up a flag in terms of an indication at the mobilisation early stage as to what that might cost. There is an intent to move in the direction of a more permanent, of a separate governance agency managing state telecoms contracts, and again it would be in the context of that exercise that the cost would be dealt with further.
Okay, but it's not insignificant then. If let's say we need to use our contingencies and the state is investing $3 billion. Actually, the cost of the project is $3.25 billion, because that's 10 million over 25 years. It's another, at least, it's probably index linked, probably higher than that. But let's say there's no index linking of it. It's an additional $250 million cost that hasn't been maybe discussed in the public arena.
No, I don't think. I mean, I can see where intuitively you would come to that and say it's 10 billion, it's 25 years. First of all, it's the cost. The cost, the governance, and the cost of governance for this project will be much more significant in the early years when the deployment is being undertaken. And the second point I'd make is, again, that's a signal in the context of the letter. It's being opened by the Secretary-General in the context of the wider costs of operating his department in his communication with his colleague, the Secretary-General in the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. But I absolutely would not extrapolate and say that it's a 25 by that figure. The figure itself is it's conservative in terms of on the upward end, and secondly, the costs of governance will be higher in the early years.
My father is saying you can never take, or use the saying all the time, you can never take salt out of the soup. My experience is once you have a 10 million allocation given to the department from central exchequer funding, you never withdraw. It never goes down. Budgets are never cut, unless there's real dramatic.
You don't always
reasons.
get 10 if you ask for 10 either, as you know from being a minister.
I move on from that. And again, from that experience, my experience and my support for the department is based on previous experience with the national broadband scheme at the time we introduced. And again, it was similar. It had similar characteristics in that we ended up at the single bidder. Now, the speeds weren't the same. It was 3 megabytes, but and it was done in 2 years. As I recall, the design and contract arrangements were all done very quickly, and we delivered it quickly. But the difference between that project and now, one of the differences, we were dealing in that instance with Hutchinson Whampoa, one of the biggest probably utility company, private infrastructure investment companies in the world, ownership of massive assets everywhere. And I have nothing against Mr McCourt, and met him at that time as Minister. He was involved in some satellite project, as I recall, speculative kind of high-tech, new technology project. But it doesn't seem, or I don't see, once Scottish Southern pulled out, and Lang pulled out, and ENET pulled out, and Air and Vodafone and ESB pulled out, there's a fundamental difference between this project where you have a much... There's no comparison between the likes of Hutchinson Whampoa and Grantham McCourt in terms of their scale and expertise, or their scale even. When you said there that we've been through various qualification process for bidders, was there a qualification done at the last stage when all those other bidders or parties had left, when we were just left? And as Deputy Dooley said, all Grantham McCourt are providing is the working capital, and that's not even up front. That's only to cover, that's just a contingency cost in case their costs are over. So they're actually providing nothing other than a letter, maybe I'm sure from a bank, to say that we'll give them the working capital if the projections are... It's only a contingency. So we're effectively dealing with the developer in this instance who doesn't have any of the experience of the likes of Scottish and Southern or Vodafone or Lang or any of these other companies, or even ENET. Did the department at any stage in this process have that final kind of sense check to see, are we dealing with a substantial company here that brings that scale of international industrial utility service scale to... When was the last qualification of the actual bidder process, not the big contract arrangement, it was just the scale of the bidder to add value in a sense is in the process. When did that happen last?
I'm going to ask Patrick Neary to come in on that, but just to clarify in terms of the bidder makeup, and there's been references to ENET's role. ENET is a subcontractor, part of the bidder, and that's where ENET has been since the outset. So ENET is still there. But I think, and in terms of that when was it last assessed? Well, I think it'll be helpful if Patrick talks through the final evaluation, but also then who is managing the company that's going to build this network, but who the subcontractors are who are going to build this network on the ground and their experiences.
Okay, well, there's two parts to that really. I think one is the technical and financial capacity of the bidder to deliver the project, and I guess the formal process that has been the pre-qualification process. The last change was concluded, and that process was concluded in September 2018, just before the final tender was submitted. As part of the actual final tender then, there was an evaluation of the technical capacity and the plans that the bidder would have to actually deliver the project over the 25 years. So an independent evaluation team was set up on the technical side, looking at the deployment capabilities and their plans to deliver that in a credible and robust fashion, the technical solution and their partners underpinning that solution, the operational organisation that they'll put in place and how they put that in place, and the processes and procedures and tools that will govern the operation of the contract once it's put in place. So that evaluation concluded earlier this year, and they have come through that independent evaluation. Yeah.
And at that stage, both Scottish and Southern and Lang had already departed.
Yes.
Okay. And they're mainly using contractors. I can't remember the name, but the one that was SiteServe turned into, I can't remember the name of it. Acavo, whatever, and ENET, and they've a series of these contractors. Can I ask a question? On the MANS project, which again I would have had experience of as Minister when we were delivering it, that was the model where the department itself, in a sense, managed the overall contract development, or the delivery, in a sense. The contract then, the department was the central coordinator of all these contracting companies and delivered it. In a sense, the department then provided the role that Grantham McCourt's doing. They're providing a kind of a coordinating, we'll use this contractor and that contractor, and we'll ring up the contractor and say, how are you getting on, or how are you checking you're delivering what you're... It's a contract management job that they're doing effectively, and the department did that for the metropolitan area networks. In my experience, that was the department. Given that we're paying 10 million a year for the department, given the department has real expertise, given that department has real experience, given that department, in my mind, has real capability in this area, and all this work in managing the contracts and managing the whole bidding, 7 years of the bidding process, there's no better people, I would think, in the whole world to deliver this type of project than the people sitting in front of me. Did we not at any stage think, well, do you know what, we can do it ourselves the same way we did the Mans, given that we've done it before?
Mr. Review Holborn, if you want to come in.
The answer would be no. We wouldn't be the best people. Certainly, there's some very good people on our team, and the man sitting to my right has very, very significant experience in terms of building telecoms networks, and we have people in the team. So is that our team is able to manage this project. But in the context of just taking demands, first of all, the role played by the local authorities there was very significant, while the department was the lead entity. The local authority role was significant. But I think it would be useful, Pat, if you talk a little to the actual the depth of expertise that is within this NBI company already before they actually build it out further, and a bit more about who the subcontractors are and their experience in Ireland and elsewhere in terms of building fibre networks, something the department doesn't have.
Yeah, and I suppose one thing I'd like to just go through in a short fashion is the challenge ahead of NBI in terms of delivering the project is it's a large-scale rollout over initially 100,000 kilometres of roadway and up to 140,000 kilometres of fibre to be rolled out. They have a substantial amount of activities to kick off at the outset in terms of getting their IT systems ready for onboarding service providers, getting the products deployed to market, as well as starting their design activities and then starting to actually roll out into the different deployment areas. In terms of how they've gone about doing that and designing a solution that we feel is credible and robust, they've put together a team of people who are highly experienced in rolling out networks in Ireland and internationally. They have brought in people with deep experience in particular using the air infrastructure. One of their lead technical people has over 40 years experience in rolling out networks.
How many full-time people do they have now in their team here?
Full-time employed. I'm not sure the employment status of people. I don't know. Do you want to take that?
If I can come in, I mean, their bid team has been, I suppose, between people working on the ground full-time for the Granham Court Group and then advisors that had, similar to us, 60 to 80 people at any one time working on the bid they'd submit. So it's 20 pages of material on the technical side and the financial side.
Mostly that's advisors and people contracted rather than full-time staff.
Which is the norm. Virgin Media, Cero, Aircom, it's the norm.
Do you want to finish, Mr. Neary? I'm conscious that you were stopped there mid-train.
Yeah, so they've proposed, I would say, the command and control that they'll put in place from these experienced individuals. They have outlined the organisations they'll put in place. It's up to 150 people in MBI, and they will then use that as their command and control to subcontract to a large number of subcontractors of highly, I would say, experienced civil and build companies, like you mentioned.
If I just, in relation to that, my recall, going back to the National Broadband Scheme, the biggest risk and one of the biggest difficulties was in the billing schemes, because that's you're dealing with 500,000 people. But my understanding of this project is that because it's wholesale access, the MBI itself won't be a direct retail company. So there won't be a billing, they won't have a Mrs. Murphy from Ballyhontas ringing. They'll have Mrs. Murphy ringing Sky or Air or Virgin.
Mr. Neary, and I think he's going to answer those questions. I get the
if I
impression
just finish the point, Chair. So that's the biggest, always the most difficult thing, system network set up to have a billing, a direct customer. They won't have any customers ringing them. You won't be able to ring NBI.
They will have a substantial billing system. Their billing is to other businesses, so it's a business-to-business billing system, and that's where we would have put a lot of focus in our procurement regarding ensuring that all service providers get equal treatment from the wholesale company that is set up. They get equivalence of inputs is a regulatory term that we would have relied on that. Any service provider would be treated equally by the wholesale provider. That's true. The interface into their IT systems is a particularly important interface. There's also an operational side to their IT systems where they maintain and monitor the networks. So between the operational systems and the billing systems, it's quite a substantial IT challenge for them to kick that off and get it in place.
Okay, can I go on to one other question if I can? Or two other questions. Again, referring to Mr. Watt's letter where he says, and this is from the Department of Public Expenditure Reform where they really have real expertise, they say that the operation is projected to have a rate of return of, we don't know what, but which seems very high given the risk profile of their investment. Now, the response, Mr. Griffin says that if it goes wrong, if we're not happy, instead of achieving that very high return according to the Department of Public Expenditure, the developer will only get a 5% return where the business underperforms. Now, this is in effect a regulated asset where the state is putting £2.25 billion up front. A 5% return for regulated assets at the moment is about what you do. What is it? Weighted average cost of capital. You'd be expecting around 5%. So if 5% is the downside for the business, I don't know what the upside is. Can you tell us what the rate of return is on the operations? Is it 20%? Higher or lower than that?
We can't tell you what the rate of return is. No, it's commercially sensitive. But
why is it commercially sensitive?
Okay, well, I mean, we've asked this a couple of times because we don't want to be putting out more information, but the bidder has been very clear, and with good reason, we believe. I mean, the rate of return is something that all investors are obviously fairly sensitive about across the world. There may be other projects or maybe other tenders that they will be going for. So publishing everything to do with this tender could put them at a competitive disadvantage in many other projects across the world or in Ireland even. But notwithstanding that, we've got a lot of advice from our corporate finance advisors around the rate of return that they have within their tender, and Dave advises that it's commensurate with the risk in the project, and it's not that different to other projects that they would have worked on across Ireland and elsewhere in terms of PPPs and otherwise. Just in terms of will they achieve 2%, 4%, 5%, 10%? It is obviously, as I said to Deputy Dooley, it's entirely dependent on how successful these guys are in designing, building and operating the network.
They've got a downside, no risk. They've got a minimum of 5% return on capital.
In the event, that's a different scenario in the context of a termination event. Right? So if the contract is terminated... No,
it says here, Mr. Griffin says they may only get a 5% return where the business underperforms. It doesn't say termination.
In the event of the normal... Forget about termination events. What they may get as a rate of return is entirely dependent on the business. I think that letter was written in the context of it might be this or it might be that. I think we were giving an upper, not a lower limit, but just an example of where it can vary. That's what the letter was intended to do. Okay? So we're not saying, what we're saying, what ultimately you're saying, and we're saying to Deputy Dooley, I mean, if a company doesn't make any money, there's no return.
Okay, but let's say, then, come back to, I take the point there, that it isn't a guarantee, it's a hypothesis. Yeah. If I get, let's say if we're saying it's 15 or 20%, doesn't matter whatever the figure is, that's the return on their initial capital investment, 175 million, and that's ongoing over the lifetime of the project, I presume, and it goes up if they put more capital in, or why do they end up owning the asset? If they got a rate of return of 15 or 20%, that's a profitable business in a regulated market with long lifetime, 25 years. Why do they own the asset at the end of it? Is 15 or 20% rate of return on your capital not enough? Why do they get to own the asset?
Well, that's, again, you need to ask the question of what's the asset, or is it a liability? I mean, what is the asset at the end of 25 years?
Well, the asset is what, again, Mr. Watt is concerned that if at the end of this period, or if there's that there has to be one of these break points, Mr. Watt is concerned that in his letter, would the existing operator have to be paid for the assets or otherwise compensated? The assets is the fibre and the whole network. It's not a small asset. Like, that's a very valuable asset. In a world where fibre is going to be hugely important.
Let's go back to my first comment about we could be hearing the ownership issue for the afternoon, because it comes back to the ownership issue, because the ownership issue sends you to that place. If it's gap funded, it stays with the bidder. And I think when you look to the engagement between the two departments, what you're actually seeing is there's an engagement there that's asking questions about the risk to the project and seeing the potential for significant downside, and the engagement is also saying the risk in the project if there's significant upside. So the discourse is the appropriate discourse, that people are looking at all of the spectrum of issues. But in terms of the asset, again, and the value of the business, like this, so the asset is the physical infrastructure that's in place. And I think you did raise a question last week, and I don't think we've got the answer for that one yet, Deputy, as to the science or the research behind the durability of fibre. We'll explore that further, but there is no question but that after 25 years, and then there's a 10-year potential extension of the contract, you're in the space of renewing infrastructure. So there's a cost for somebody, either the person who holds it in the gap-funded model, the private entity, or the state. But the Minister, in answering parliamentary questions yesterday, I think it was helpful in that he gave an indication of, if Deputy Dooley, I think you alluded to this, to do the maths in terms of if people are paying €30 a month and there's 400,000 of them, that's suggesting that by the time you get to year 25 in this, you could have a turnover of 150 million. But then when you start doing the maths in addition to that, and who knows where poll prices will be then, but take it on today's figures, in terms of your rentals, and you're at 40 to 50 million there, and you've 150 people working for you, you have poles that will need to be replaced following storms, you've upgrades to equipment. There isn't a very high likely profitability in this business at year 25. And again, this is going back to the ownership and the gap fund, so I won't go on at length on it. But again, on the pros and cons there, it depends on what happens at year 25. So if this business was very profitable, you'd like to have it. And if there was, it could well pay its way in terms of any reinvestment, you'd like to have it. But if it's a case that at year 20, the profitability required a significant judgment as to whether it was worth reinvesting, and this was to come back to the state. The risk for the state there is that the private investor would not reinvest further and wouldn't be incentivised to do so because they wouldn't have it. So it's caught up in that. But I think what sight must be held to is that the likely value of the business at year 25 it's likely to be relatively low, because the potential profitability is very low, because this is, as you rightly say, at the point post-deployment. So there's a risk up to the point of deployment, but post-deployment and then post-people coming on board, then what you have is a regulated utility that is limited to selling wholesale services.
It's full of risks. And one last question. Yeah. It's full of risks, and the job of the political system is sometimes to take risks, and I'd be perfectly willing to take risks in funding broadband to fibre to Irish rural homes. But I believe, given the fact that we're putting in £3.25 billion potentially, and the developer's putting in 175, I see no reason why we shouldn't have gone for a concession model where we own it at the end, so that the upside risk belongs to us in the end. One last question, and you mentioned there about the ESB and engagement with them, and I've similarly been talking to them and others over the last year on the possibility of using their pole network, because there is a certain strategic sense in terms of, do we need two sets of poles across the country? My understanding is that the technology risk and the regulatory risks and all those other risks are relatively minimal, because ESBs are already out there rolling out to 500,000 homes, so we know they can do it. We know that they've learned a lot in the last few years. The biggest risk is getting anything done across a field rather than down a road, whereas the air poles are on the road network by and large at the edge of the field. The ESB network goes across the field, and the biggest, my understanding and sense in talking to everyone involved in this the last year or two, is that actually the biggest problem might be getting agreement of landowners to doing that. Not that it would actually in really way discommode a landowner. The likes of Timmy here would be, I'm sure, first up as a dairy farmer to say no problem at all, go straight across. But my understanding is the downside risk that the ESB and others saw was that mightn't be the case, that any time you're doing anything in Ireland, anywhere, that getting access to land to run even to run a cable, which can't take more than an hour or two to run a cable along a wire across a field, but it was getting access across a field was the biggest problem. If we had or could tackle that, if we could get agreement from rural Ireland, because this project is benefiting rural Ireland, that, you know what, we'll all club in and we'll work well together here to make sure that the ESB have no difficulty getting across the field, do you think that would have made a material difference to what we've done? Am I right in my assessment that that maybe issue is probably the biggest challenge for the ESB, is the land ownership, the field, John B. Keane kind of scenario, never in my life would you ever get across this land. Was that the biggest problem in amalgamation, so we have a single set of poles? As Deputy Stanley says, ESB one's probably far better conditioned than the air ones. Was that the thing which stopped us using that as a preferred route?
I'll just, again, briefly, Deputy, I mean, that's one of a list of issues, I suppose, that we would have gone through with the ESB, the actual access to the ESB network and how you cohabitate broadband electricity without discommoding electricity consumers, and the impact on wholesale and retail prices for electricity if you're sharing poles and sharing ducts and all the rest. And when you're connecting rural homes, it is different to connecting urban homes, which is predominantly underground, and switching maybe customers off in one area because there's broadband connected in another. There's an array of issues which you probably would get through, and we plan to get through them with the ESB so that that network is available. But in the context of the programme we have in place, would it be done faster or any cheaper to the current plan? I think the answer we've gotten that is, well, we certainly don't know, but we don't believe it would be, is what we would say. And in terms of the road network at Eircom, yes, they have just done 300,000 and learnt an awful lot from them, and it worked very well. So we have a proven network as opposed to an unproven network in the electricity one across land, across every part of rural Ireland. So the bidder has chosen that network because obviously it wants to have lesser risk on that rollout plan, and KN Networks and those companies that are the contractors are now very familiar with what it takes to put fibre on Eircom poles and under Eircom ducts. So the same contractors, I would say, would not have the same experience of using the ESB network and getting authorised to climb ESB poles.
Okay, I'm going to move on to Senator Tim Lombard.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And maybe for the next session that we might rotate the speakers. We started with Timmy today. We might rotate.
It was in order of who indicated to me. Yeah.
I think maybe we might look at a different format, so Chair, if you could. First of all, I'd like to welcome the Department, and it's great to have everyone here. I think it's a very important issue that we're debating. Could I just get clarification on the benefit-cost ratio and how that actually operates itself? In your actual presentation, you've mentioned the terminology 1.115 to 1 as the most conservative estimate, and then it goes on to the higher estimate of 2.14 to 1. I do think they are two competing different figures. You might elaborate on how there's a difference between both of those figures, one being the conservative, one being the highest one, and how that analysis actually happened. You might also elaborate on the key indicators that weren't taken into consideration. I think you mentioned e-health was one of them. You also mentioned the unusual one of climate change, which I never heard until today. We've obviously gone through a very extensive process here in the Oireachtas of producing a climate change report, which all departments came and told us what they needed to do regarding ensuring we meet our 2030 and 2050 targets. You might elaborate on how that wasn't considered to be a priority when it came to the actual issue itself. In particular, the climate change element of it. I would consider the lack of broadband in rural Ireland, climate change, all tied in together, that not to be a core part of the actual figures. You might elaborate how that was excluded, if you could.
So in any order you wish.
Okay, maybe at a very high level, just in terms of what wasn't in the CBA, and maybe further we'll talk to the detail of the pessimistic versus optimistic. The CBA, there's a methodology there in the public spending code, and I think it's a very good discipline, and you can't make it up as you go, so you better have the same set of rules for all CBAs, so as government has the ability to look at project A versus B versus C over time. But you're right in, the Minister has called out benefits that cannot be captured under the public spending code, like e-health, e-education, social inclusion, rural development, tourism and climate. And in fact, yesterday, the Minister, in responding to parliamentary questions, focused in on the stats that are there in terms of the percentage of time that people will engage in remote working. And I think it's 4% is the figure that's there, but it's recognised that today that number is a bigger number, that number is growing. And it's a reality that when you're dealing with a technology project, and it's something that the Secretary-General called out in his response to the Secretary-General in Public Expenditure and Reform, that I suppose what it's saying really is important as a tool that government can understand what would a CBA give you for a project like this, so you understand, having gone through that rigour, the answer you get. The answer is positive. But to recognise that the methodology, that it has limitations as an analytical tool, when the actual benefits that will result, that they can't be measured at this point in time. I mean, if you were to conduct a CBA on the introduction of the smartphone and follow the set of rules, the benefits that you would have included would have been limited to the use of a phone for phone calls and texts, and yet we recognise all of the other, online banking, email, social media, entertainment, etc., that you start using with your smartphone and applications. But it's the rigour that's there in the process, and you can't be inventing a process to match the project. But you have to recognise as decision makers then that there's limitations on a CBA for a technology project. To explain the actual pessimistic and optimistic, Tom McCormick might.
In terms of the central and pessimistic scenario, as we call it, essentially the central scenario is looking at the costs in terms of without this conditional and contingent subsidy, in other words, without this additional costs associated with it. So the project itself, the scope of the project doesn't change, so the benefits then remain the same, except we're looking at a scenario of where, in the central case, we're saying that it's going to be a figure of 2.1 billion, as Fergal alluded to, ex-VAT. And then in the other scenario, it's the additional cost of the 480 million in terms of conditional costs. When you factor that in, then you're getting a central scenario of 1.3 to 1. And in the pessimistic scenario, it's 1.15 to 1. So it's that additional costs, we have this contingency, it's a differentiation between the 2 points.
Okay, if I could just round on the issue about the climate change issue. The chairperson and other members of this committee would have spent 6 or 8 months going through a very elaborate process of putting together a report regarding how we could move our nation forward. Is it true so that in the CPA process, climate change is not considered as a priority in that process today?
It's the constraint that's on you is that you can only include benefits that you have the empirical evidence to substantiate. So until you actually have the body of data, so going forward, what you'd anticipate is that at a point in the future you would be able to do that but you first of all have to have the data available to you and the empirical evidence to underpin it.
So it's not considered at the moment in the actual process?
No.
And like from my own point of view and other members, we would have sat around, literally spent weeks and months going through the scenario. I would think it's bizarre, to say the very least, that in the present climate we're in, that the department wouldn't consider that in the actual, when they did the CBA. Would you think that was a fault?
Senator Lombard.
If I could speak.
Senator Lombard now speaking uninterrupted.
I think the point here I make is that the CBA was one element of one input into the decision for the Department and the Minister to recommend to Government to move to preferred bidder stage. But the wider benefits that will flow from this project, including the impact on climate action and the ability of people to remote work, etc., they are considerations that were fully articulated in that decision.
Okay. Regarding the actual maintenance of the actual network going forward for the next 25 years, take we have a storm scenario that we will have, that we've had over the last 18 months. What contingency or what actual maintenance contracts are available? Crews, people, personnel. You take the scenario with the ESB, they could call on personnel from Northern Ireland in the last storm that came down. Do we have, or what is the actual built-in formula to actually look at those kind of issues?
So that would have been very central to our evaluation of the proposal, that when they're operating the network, that they have sufficient field staff available to cater for maintaining the network, and their processes to cater for events such as storms, etc. So how it's catered for in the contract is there's key performance indicators on the repair and maintenance of the network that they are held to, and there is a reporting obligation on them to ensure that they, on a monthly basis, they supply the governance agency with visibility of what's happening in the field. We would have also looked at how have they resourced that. Have they subcontracts arranged to put the people in place in the locations as they build the network, and then maintain that the ability to satisfy that performance level that they're signing up to. So there's key repair times that are in there, and they've demonstrated through the resourcing and the subcontracts that underpin that the ability to deliver those targets.
Okay.
Thank you, Senator. I'm going to move on to Senator Joe O'Reilly.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. Welcome to our guests. If I could just make a two-sentence statement at the outset and then try to raise some questions, obviously some of which are touched on already, or are touched on already, but we're all individually responsible to people who elect us, so we have to ask them again, some of them. But I'd just make a two-sentence statement at the outset. I'd say that I'm personally very happy that we are here discussing the working out of a scheme to give the same opportunities to the people of rural Ireland as to their urban cousins. And I'd secondly say that had a cost-benefit analysis been done on rural electrification before it began, it could in no way have encapsulated the value of that subsequently. And I think the same applies here. But to move on to specifics, am I correct in saying that given the contingency built in, which I gather is about, you can correct me on specific figures, is about about 500 million, circa 500 million, the contingency, to avoid overruns and to avoid, so that, does that get over all the things that happened with the other celebrated project, the National Children's Hospital? Are you confident that you have, within that figure, dealt with all eventualities and that we're safe there, that we're good to go, and we can assure people watching us today that there will be no further costs and that the contingency is adequate? And secondly, related to that, could you say that obviously there's a 20% return of VAT, there's a discernible figure of a return of VAT, which I gather is potentially something like 345 million, that kind of figure, and if you want to give a specific, but could I ask you, related to the return and related to the previous question, what do you think is the potential and how will it work of a claw back to the state, given that I would project, and I mean, this is, we're a little bit in, you know, it's slightly intangible, but I would assume that with the trend in society and all the factors at work sociologically and every way in our society, that the take-up will be increasing, and that we will be dealing with a blanket take-up. It'll be the equivalent of, not to go to harp back to rural electrification, there will be no home, there will be no premises in the Ireland to come that will be without this. In that situation, do you project, how will the claw back to the state work? If it does, if we have a good scenario, how will that work? How well is that proofed, and what percentage will come back, and are you confident around that? Are you satisfied, and I know this is a recurring theme in all the questioning and media coverage of this issue, are you satisfied, apart from the initial equity, which I don't necessarily think is that huge an issue, but what's more important, are you satisfied that NBI have the financial capacity right through, have you that properly stress tested to meet their obligations continuously over the period? I think that's a much more important question personally through my limited understanding of business, then that they would have a nice flowery figure at the outset and not have the durability for the long haul and to stay with it. And you might just comment on that. And while some of these points are obvious to those people who are very immersed in it, there are people out there watching this and people who will expect us to establish these things in layman's terms. We have within this room a very immersed group of people, but not everybody outside understands that. So I'd like to know around that. Could you say what you did to establish that these people have the capacity to meet their commitments right through, as much as that they have a certain amount of down payment? And, you know, how are they checked on that level?
Sorry, am I interrupting you? Sorry, are they
I'm nearly there now.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I'm nearly there. You know, this thing about the asset after 35 years and this thing, or this idea that we should have held on to the asset, I'd ask two things. What will be there after 35 years? What do you envisage being there? And what do you envisage being there? What will the reality after 35 years be? Now, I understand that you can't account for technological advance in the interim, but what do you project based on current knowledge? What happens in the period from the 25 to the 35-year period? I gather there's a kind of a lacuna there, that if I understand this correctly, that the contract and documents last for 25 years. What happens in the sort of intervening 10? You seem to be looking to a 35-year period and then tighten for 25. I'd just like to know about that. I'd like again your comment around the popular belief, and on my social media pages, this kept coming back to me from people responding to me when I put up the standard thing that we people put up, welcoming the plan or whatever. The thing coming back all the time was, why not go with 5G? And could you comment on that? That's the popular belief. People watching us today, watching this broadcast, or people who watch this stuff today and follow it, will be thinking in the back of their mind, surely 5G would have done the business. So you know otherwise, but I'd like that elaborated on for those who have doubts around it. And a classic other question that arises, why not the ESB? And would you explain why? Because there is a certain traction with the ESB in the public consciousness, and people relate to the ESB as an entity and have confidence therein. And people say, well, why is that not the vehicle that's delivering? But I do know that they would have to go through similar, but would you explain why they're not the vehicle? Now, would you explain, if you don't mind, the graduated nature of the payment? Because I think taxpayers have this concept that somebody is going to arrive with a cheque for 3 billion and hand it to Mr. McCourt next September, and that and depend on his goodwill and on his competencies after. Would you explain the relationship between work done and payment, and how you project the payments going over a period? Because over a period of time, it's a very different proposition to say you'll pay X for so many years and X plus as you go along, rather than saying you'll put a down payment of so much. And would you be beginning to see a return during that time? Some of the benefits that my colleague earlier talked about, the non-established benefits to date, even the very fact if you took commuters off the road and put them living down in dispersed areas where they were home working and they weren't seeking accommodation in Dublin, those benefits will come as we go along. But really the question is about the graduated payments there. And are you totally satisfied that of NBI on, I know you have a procurement process, but you might comment again, on all their technical competencies as well as their financial competencies? And why is it a 7-year period? It seems a very long period, given that if I understand you correctly, you're suggesting that 134,000 premises would be complete in the first year. Sorry. The first 2 years. Well, then it's a 5-year period to complete the rest. It seems inordinately long, and you might comment, or are there any attempts being made to bring that forward? Surely there'd be a commercial imperative for the company to want to bring it forward anyway, and that might help. The question, and it has been raised, but it is a popular question, and why not address it once more? Why were Éire allowed to cherry pick the 300,000 premises? I know there's an official answer to that which we're provided with, but the people who elect us out there will wonder if this question is not addressed. So I don't see that I have more to say. It's been very well rehashed, but I think it would be wrong if it wasn't.
Thank you, Senator. And I know you've addressed some of those questions, and maybe you can address them briefly or refer back. You're all on the transcript here, but yeah, I'll let you answer.
Thanks, Senator. And I think you, in fairness, Senator, you have put a significant number of questions to us, but you've done it very articulately and in a short space of time. And we'll try to match that in terms of responding. So I'm going to pass over to Fergal Mulligan in a moment to deal with your first 5, maybe, and one other question. Patrick might deal with the 5G, the technical competence of NBI, and the 7-year rollout. And I'll conclude by dealing with the two organisational, the ESB and the Air 300K. So we'll see if we can keep with your brevity.
Thank you, Senator. And I can guarantee you, myself and Kieran keep asking Patrick there, why is it 7 years every day? So, and we'll continue to do that. So we'll let him answer that. Just on the contingency, is it adequate? I suppose it has been assessed over since 2016, 17, 18. We were with all the bidders, and more lately the recent bidder, in terms of looking at all the things that all of them were telling us were a risk to the project and a risk that they couldn't quantify. And through all of that dialogue and the 800 odd hours, we came up with all the things that we, the state, would be happy, not happy, but we would seem reasonable to share the risk with them on. Because there's all the other activities where if it's construction risk and it's not in the 14 activities, that's a risk that they share. So we have quantified them, be it tree trimming or said fibre cables or subcontractor labour rates or whatever it might be. They're all quantified, and a risk assessment has been carried out on them of where they might go in the worst case scenario, and that's what we have in the 480 million. So with the best will in the world, we've assessed that, and that's what we believe is the maximum cost that could be incurred in the worst case scenario, with no need to ever come back to the state for another penny. That's our current informed opinion from all of the experts in our own assessments, and that's what's we went to the government with. Clawback is based in 3 areas. There's clawback on the costs. If they don't spend money, we claw it back. If they have excess profits, we claw it back. And if they have a value on the business, a significant value in the business at year 25, we claw a percentage of that back as well. I won't speculate on what clawback amounts might be. It's very difficult to say. Again, as we've talked about before, how good this business does over the next 25 years is obviously a big question. And some people say it's doomed to failure. Some people say there'll be no take-up. Others say it's going to be a huge success. It's hopefully somewhere in the middle, and clawback will be based on those, but it's based on very thorough spreadsheets which are calculated based on the bid model submitted versus actual outturns. So the numbers and the ring-fence nature of the numbers will be done by accountants and locked in, so whatever percentage it is, it is. I suppose in terms of the capacity of MBI, we just touched on that. I suppose it's not a matter of opinion. They have passed a very, very strict bar of an evaluation test, which they had to prove to us that they'll have the capacity and the teams to do it. They've passed that test. They didn't just barely pass it, they actually passed it quite well. So on the basis of the evaluation carried out, we're satisfied on that front. I think, again, what will be the ownership, what will be there at the end, again, we hope there's at the year 35, a successful wholesale open access business that's creating loads of retail competition, and consumers are getting a very good set of services at prices akin to urban areas. That company, though, will be in a competitive market with the likes of Open Air, BT and other companies that will be buying services from it, but possibly even selling services against it. So that's what we hope is there, again, if it's a successful output. Between year 25 and 35, again, as part of the outcome of the dialogue process, the Department wanted to avoid any cliff edge at year 25, so we insisted on a 10-year commitment beyond year 25, where the current owners of National Broadband Ireland will continue running the business at no cost to the state beyond year 25, because there will invariably be possibly customers that remain uneconomic or at a cost that may not be profitable, but they are committing to honour the contracts and all services in the area for a further 10 years at no cost to the state. And that commitment is contracted in the contract with us this year. In terms of that, I think that's with the 25 years. I leave the 5G and the ESB and the 7 years to Patrick, and then the aircon bit and ownership maybe to yourself. Patrick, I'll let you come in.
Okay, I'll try to match Fergal in brevity.
What I said to do was the stage payments. Sorry, Senator. Yes, you're right. The payments are incrementally over the next 10 years mainly. Payments continue from year 11 to 25 as well, because we only pay them as customers are connected. So there is payments for designing the network, payments for passing the networks, and payments for connections, and that's in 110 deployment areas. So there will be some money required next year, more the following year. Probably when they're in a mass rollout of 100,000 premises a year, there'll be significant subsidies in year 3, 4, 5.
Not to interrupt you, and I really appreciate the detailed answers. You're very, very thorough. Wouldn't it be very helpful if the great taxpayers of Ireland were aware of that? I think they should be made aware of the incremental nature of it and what it would be year by year.
I agree. Yeah. And we've tried to do that.
But that's not totally your function.
Absolutely.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean.
I suppose
Appreciate it, Joe.
Yes, we'll have to make sure they don't.
in terms of 5G, Senator, I suppose what I would like to clarify is that the procurement did not specify a technology at the outset. It was invited bidders to come forward what they felt was the most suitable technology. So we didn't specify a fibre to the home technology in the procurement. What was examined was what is the most efficient, economical way to do this project, and all bidders that participated in the process concluded fibre to the home was the best way to do that. Alternative solutions such as wireless or 5G were certainly considered. We modelled that ourselves in terms of mixing different technologies, using maybe wireless in certain instances and fibre in others. Ultimately, there are challenges in a lot of technologies. On the 5G side, it would require thousands of new masts to be built around the countryside to reach all premises. Ultimately, that is a challenge in itself for the deployment. Then it would require also those sites to be maintained, and to be rental costs for them over the full 25 or 35 years. And obviously 5G will turn into 6G or 7G or 8G over the long period, so there will be technology upgrades required as well on the wireless side. But ultimately, all technologies were considered, and ultimately, the fibre to the home was concluded as the best one for this project. Taking the technical capacity and competencies of the bidder, they were evaluated as part of a substantial evaluation test, particularly in the final tender. We've published the technical capabilities that we tested. They were around the actual technical solution itself, the products that were going to be produced and offered, the deployment solutions, and the operational solutions. So there was an independent team put together to evaluate those, and again the bidder passed the final tender evaluation. So why 7 years? I suppose what I'd like to outline is that the scope of the project involves quite a substantial ramp-up period in the first year, where the IT systems are put in place and service providers who will sell the service are brought on board so they can sell the services. In parallel to that, the bidder will be doing detailed designs, which involves people going down every road, every boreen in the countryside to identify what existing infrastructure can be reused or not, and then coming back and producing a low-level design that is the optimum design for that particular location. So that's the first effort that needs to be involved. That leads then to an order to be placed towards AIR to remediate their infrastructure, if that's the infrastructure that's going to be used. That's a substantial work in itself. In parallel with that, the bidder would then do activities such as other preparatory activities like tree trimming, brackets on poles, etc., before they actually get to start laying the fibre. In parallel with that, they're looking at the local authority applications for licences if they need to do any road closures or any digs in terms of digging towards broken ducts or anything like that. So through the dialogue with the bidders, all these tasks and issues came to the fore, and when you put the rate or throughput that can be achieved by the likes of AIR in preparing their networks, the local authority applications, the subcontractors, ultimately they came together in the final tender submission from the bidder last year, and that really, in that process, they had to then demonstrate that their plan was credible and could be achieved, and the outcome of that was that they could do this within a 7-year period. And there are opportunities, and there certainly are attempts to bring forward that timeline, in particular working with AIR to see if they can make ready their network earlier, so that the MBI contractor can roll out their fibre earlier. And also through the work of the Mobile Phone and Broadband Task Force, we're working with the local authorities and ensuring that they're ready for the applications that will go through them, through the broadband officers that are now in place. So there are certainly attempts to bring forward that 7-year period, and as you mentioned, there is a commercial imperative to do it as quickly as possible as well.
And then to conclude very briefly, in terms of DSB, well, at a corporate level, DSB was involved in the CSIRO bid and withdrew from the process. But in terms of an infrastructure provider, as Patrick would have outlined earlier, the country is broken into 110 deployment areas, and when it comes to the point of actually designing the low-level design for how to reach those 5,000 premises within that deployment area, the bidder will be looking at using all existing infrastructure and options. So it's predominantly based on the AIR network, but will certainly be also looking at using the ESB infrastructure. In terms of the 300k, I mean, we've been here before in terms of that. The procurement had a process whereby recognising that you're operating in a live market, the environment is subject to change, and that telecoms companies could come forward with proposals that could impact on the procurement, on the intervention, on the map. AIR engaged with that process. They were assessed, and it was concluded that they had followed the process. It was consistent with state aid rules, and the 300,000 premises were removed from the map. That had some implications, certainly, for the procurement process in terms of costs, in terms of benefits, and certainly in terms of the length of time. I think the learning from that and from operating in a live environment has absolutely influenced the approach to the contract, which is to recognise that as you go forward over the next 25 years, that this bidder with a contract will be operating in a market that is subject to change. So what we have done is in the contract is we've sought to tie down and close out the areas of risk in that market, because we can't anticipate exactly the direction of travel of such change. But the final comment I'd make on the AIR 300k is that, well, you'll know this as a public representative. I mean, for public representatives in rural Ireland and for parliamentary questions to the Minister, their most topical one is the person who lives closest to the AIR 300k, because people are getting a wonderful service over the 300k and their neighbours are envious, and that's where we're seeking to fill that void through the NBP.
Thank you very much. We're going to conclude. You had one brief question, Deputy Dooley?
I have a few now, but
can you do it briefly? Because I'm just conscious that the officials have been here for a number of hours. To try have just questions only would be great.
Great. I'll try and keep it to questions. So, just there's this assertion's been made that the liability is uncapped at Granahan McCourt. So, state's liability is capped at up to 3 billion, and that they take on an uncapped liability. What instrument is used to guarantee that position? So, maybe you could answer that. I just have a couple, so I'll keep it very brief, and if we could do it.
The contract is the tool to manage that. So, through the contract, they take on a whole range of responsibilities. There's the contract addresses the money that they have committed to in terms of equity, working capital, etc. That will be contractualised. But in terms of what they have to deliver, that's set out in the contract. That's the instrument.
So what instrument then is used to give effect to the future protection of the state, since the state, in the event of any failure or evaporation of one of the owners, what connection is back to the shareholder? Is there a shareholder guarantee? Does the shareholder or the shareholders in the new company, do they guarantee the contract? Is there any recourse between the NBP company, the holding company and the shareholders?
The contract sets out what it is that they are obliged to deliver, and the recourses, so the deliverables are set there in that contract. The recourse is through that, and the enforcement is there through that.
Yeah, maybe I'm just putting it across incorrectly, so we'll take it carefully. So you have the ultimate company that's going to do the work, and then there's this holding company, and then there's the shareholders. So in the event that the broadband company doesn't perform, and as a result develops a significant liability or requirement for investment, what guarantee does the state have that the shareholder will invest further share capital or make good any liabilities that are there? What I'm trying to understand here is, because I'm somewhat concerned that there's the National Broadband Ireland, there's a holding company, there's Granahan McCourt Ireland, which in effect is another subsidiary of Granahan McCourt, and then we have Tetrad over here. Tetrad seems to me to be the company with the money. And what I want to understand is what encumbrance is on Tetrad, or ultimately whoever the money person is, because it has changed along the way. It was McCourt Global at a while. So what instrument is used to retain Tetrad, if it is Tetrad, at the table over the protracted period of this contract? So in essence, if there's further capital required, what encumbrance is placed on Tetrad? And what legal instrument? Because quite frankly, the contract is different. The contract is between the state, as I understand it, help me if I'm wrong here, is between the state and NBI and perhaps Granahan McCourt. But I want to know what grip you have on the people with the money to put it in if it's needed.
Sorry, I'll just take that quite simply, and I'm going to be brief because I'm not a lawyer, okay? But
Neither am I, no.
But I spent a couple of hours in a room with both sets of lawyers this morning on that very point around the shareholder agreements that have to be put in place that underpin the contract. So you do, without all these contracts, and that's why, because I'm not a lawyer, in any of these PPPs or large infrastructure projects, of course there's a spider web of contracts that are signed by lots of different individuals, including the Minister. So, for example, we will have direct agreements with the subcontractors. We'll even have a direct agreement with KA Networks, for example, with Actavo, with them. So you absolutely go above National Broadband Ireland in the context of the committed agreements and legal ability to enforce the contract. You don't just sit, it's not as if, like National Broadband Ireland is the broadband company, but the obligations don't sit just at National Broadband Ireland. They flow all the way to the people that are the people that put in their bid. So they have to honour the contract. And what's the cause and effect? They could lose all their money. If they put in more money and it collapses, they could lose that money. They can lose all that, and we have a charge over all the assets that are built until the full contract is honoured for 25 years. So like any bank that has a mortgage with a homeowner, the homeowner is not off the hook till it fully honours its mortgage. We have the same with this bidder in terms of the assets. So if there's an asset there for fibre cable, we have a charge over all assets that are built and funded through National Broadband Ireland. So that's just one aspect. There is obviously a bond that they have to put up. There's obviously a lot of warranties and indemnities that they have to honour in the contract, which if they don't fulfil them, they could be sued by the state. And they have to sign up to all of those things. And that's why we spend the next 2 or 3 months contractualising all that in nth degree, all the way from NBI, Holco, and up to the people that, as you said, Tetrad and Granahan McCourt. So that's all in place in terms of the contracts, and that's why you have a data room, as they call it. I found out this morning at contract close for 2 weeks, because there's a myriad of documents that are signed by all of those people, and the Minister, to ensure that over 25 years, there's not somebody just walks away and then that's the end of it. There's big consequences of walking away from this contract.
Yeah, for sure, and I suppose that's where the concern for me is in relation to the ownership. It all speaks to the ownership model that's associated with the gap funding versus the concession model, because when you have those myriad of companies and obligations somewhat denigrate over time, and they certainly denigrate as you move from one holding company to the next. What I'd like to see is that direct link back to the people that actually have the money, and whether they're absolutely required to remain committed, because they've been in and out, as I said, like Lanigan's ball for a while. So whoever is the final money entity needs to be connected. So would you commit to providing us with whatever documentation you can that shows the linkage between all these companies, who owns what the shareholdings are, and what instrument is used to ensure that they remain on the hook for any additional monies that have to be invested. So clearly you don't have that available to you, and you didn't, and you're not aware fully of the breakdown of who owns what in terms of shareholding. So maybe you can provide that to us.
Happy to do so.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Thanks very much. Just a couple of other brief ones. See, for me, like, there's the cost and value for money, which is really important. We've got to address that. But rapid deployment of high-speed broadband is the big issue, really, because that speaks to the policy behind all of this. And 7 years is not rapid deployment. And what I want to try to understand in terms of the contingency plan that you looked at in 2019 in particular, and you've done some. I think you said there the information presented in this document has been developed with the intent of illustrating what could potentially be achieved in a Plan B scenario, using high-level assumptions and assuming favourable timelines to complete a number of complex tasks. Does that imply, I suppose, that the costings of the alternative was not detailed in nature, that was kind of more high-level analysis, or was it detailed?
The analysis is relatively high level, but informed by the people who participated in developing it having a very deep understanding of the build, what's involved in building this infrastructure, the rollout, how that could be delivered. So it is a high level analysis, but informed by a very deep, detailed understanding coming out of the procurement process.
Yeah, and you said, like, the subsidy estimate presented in this paper, as well as the costings, revenue projections, timelines and other supporting assumptions have been extrapolated from information provided by the bidder. That's Granahan McCourt, is it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you're kind of taking their numbers and using it to extrapolate how other alternatives might be costed. Okay, so you're relying on their information
plus your own.
Okay, plus your own. Like, did you do fully costed? Did you do a full cost model on the alternatives?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Just again, and I mean, it is the experience of other projects and this project, where in the absence of a detailed engagement with the people that might do a Plan B, it's highly dangerous to publish numbers for a Plan B1, B2, B3 in the absence of having that, because then in 2 years' time somebody will tell us you got that completely wrong if you went to a Plan B. The other part of that is, if for some reason there was a Plan B, we do not want to give away our hand on what our internal workings are of what it will cost to get fibre to, for example, one plan was bring fibre to a certain point in the village or outside the village. Of course, we've got detailed costings of all of that. When we go, if we ever had to go to the market, inevitably the market will probably provide very different costings. So, that's the challenge you have on a Plan B.
No, I accept that. But you see the difficulty that we have as politicians. We're charged by the Taoiseach to look at alternatives, to look at what you're doing, not rule out the plan you have in place. But without information, it's very difficult to make a valued judgment. I'm not calling into question your judgment, but if we're all in this together in an attempt to address the critical piece, which is the rollout. See, I looked at some of the alternatives. You did 2019, looked at three options. In 2018, you looked at 6. And you look at, the language here is absolute, to do something to 100% of the homes. like, did anybody look at the idea of where the sweet spot is between timing and costs based on fibre and wireless? Where that sweet spot's in terms of trying to get it deployed as quickly as possible, using as much fibre as possible, but not using all fibre. Like, from my experience representing both urban, suburban and fairly rural parts of the constituency, there are people on the periphery who, if they were told they'd get a wireless option, I'm not going to get into the technologies of wireless, whether it's 4G, 5, 6 or 7, or whether it's packet radio network or whatever, right? But a fixed wireless option. And they were told they'd get that in 3 years, 3.5 years. They'd take the hand of whoever would offer that, versus now being told you're going to get fibre with all the facilities of our friends here, that they'll be able to monitor their temperature, their health, their heartbeat, all of that in 7 or 8 years. Good lot of them will be dead by then. Children who are starting secondary school next September will be through university before they'll get that deployment. So, there seems to have been this absolute position that there has to be fibre to the home in 100% of the cases, with the exception of 1 or 2%. Did anybody look at bringing back the scale, saying, what if we did it to 70% or 80%?
I'm going to ask Pat to come in on that in a second, but just, I mean, the technology wasn't being driven by the government. The technology came from the industry, and we all absolutely get that frustration, and I know it from the team here, and in terms of the length of time it will take to get to the last home. I think it would be useful, Pat, to talk to two things. One is the practicality or otherwise of a very hybrid model. So if you were going for 30 or 40% of wireless, in terms of the work that we did, where we modelled what it looks like and what that would actually mean in terms of what you'd have to cover by fibre, which I understand to mean that you would still be covering most of the same area if you go for a hybrid approach. And the second maybe is work that Comric has done, the Plum work, in terms of if you're going wireless 100%, the scale of additional mass that you require and the rollout and the build-out time there, because it could be quite significant.
Yeah, no, I think that's a given. I think, but I'm just wondering what analysis was done, or what kind of information you could provide on that optimum model, somewhere between 20 and 25%
so
wireless.
we definitely looked at mixing the technologies and have different percentages of fixed wireless and fibre, or other technologies as well were considered. We looked at different, I suppose, having a predominant solution being, say, fibre, and then the delta being used by a fixed wireless, say 20%, 5%, etc. So we have looked at lots of different variants of this. Ultimately, just come back to what Kieran was hinting at there, is that when you deploy a fixed wireless network, you may pick up a number of homes through that deployment, but ultimately you do need to bring fibre out to backhaul those particular sites, so you are building a lot of fibre to those particular sites anyway. What you find, if you mix that then with a fibre deployment, you end up building a lot of the same infrastructure anyway, because your fixed wireless service will not take contiguous every single home along a road. It might take 60% or 70% of them, and then you have to still build the fibre down the same road to get to the last tree. So you're not substantially reducing the fibre costing by introducing an overlay of a fixed wireless network. So it's not a case that you can say, okay, I'm going to do this section here with fixed wireless, and all of those premises are then removed, and then I'll do the remainder with fibre. You're overlaying two networks on top of each other. So yeah, we have done a lot of analysis on what works best, but ultimately we've had like serious teams of bidders with real in-depth technical expertise examining the same question. I'd point out that two of the bidders have mobile arms, or have, like, Air and Vodafone are backing the Cyril bid. So they had serious mobile expertise and wireless expertise to draw upon to look at that as well. and they all concluded that a predominantly fibre to the home network was the best way to do this. Obviously, we looked at a full fixed wireless access topology as well, deployment. Independent of us, the Gomrig's Plum report, it shows that over 4,500 new masts would be required to be deployed, and the deployment time of that is quite substantial. They estimated it was well over 10 years. Now, we would look at how the bidder has come to the conclusion. We have examined that thoroughly to see have they robustly examined the variance, and that certainly was part of our analysis. I think if I touched on everything here, yeah.
Do you want to come back in? Did you? No, sorry.
Just
Senator
a very
Ryan.
final man or woman in the street question, and that's gone. I'm gone then. I presume I kind of anticipate the answer, but I still want to ask it if you don't mind. If the entire NBI or part thereof were to sell their interests or be taken over, or as they say in the jargon, flip, sell on, all things remain the same. There are mechanisms to how would that work? That there would be no interest lost so if in a year's time they found someone to buy them over or take them over.
Yes, so Senator,
so something that will occur to people watching us.
Certainly, for at least the first 8 years, the Minister must approve any such changes in shareholdings. Shareholding changes are allowed under the 25-year contract, but they must go through the Department / the Minister for approval. But in the first 9 years, he's a specific veto, I suppose, over any change of ownership or majority change of ownership, should he have any issue with who a new owner might be in the context of honouring the contract. But the most fundamental point is anybody looking to take a shareholding in National Broadband Ireland would have to meet the same responsibilities and the contract.
Thank you very much, and thank you for giving us this time this afternoon. I think you were very good in interacting with our members here, and we got a lot of clarity around many of the questions that people are raising with us as well here. So, and I think you're going to forward us on a diagram, and any other information you feel would be relevant for our work. We'd very much appreciate it. So, on behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank you all for coming before us today, and the committee stands adjourned until 9:30 a.m. on the 5th of June. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Carla.